Chapter 776. Lin Guiying's words stunned Li Yundong. He thought about it carefully and said, "Senior Lin, I wish everyone in the world could speak Chinese and believe in traditional Chinese medicine. However, I believe you also know that the huge cultural gap between the East and the West can't be eliminated in a day or two. Moreover, if you want to promote traditional Chinese medicine in the United States, you can't do it without a huge amount of manpower and material resources." As he said this, he looked at Lin Guiying and smiled sincerely. "I know that your family is very rich, but your money doesn't come from nowhere. It's earned through hard work. Promoting traditional Chinese medicine in the United States may be a thankless task. I don't want you to spend all your money on this thing that is likely to fail." Lin Guiying looked at Li Yundong in surprise. She had thought that the young man in front of her would be overjoyed and take the opportunity to persuade her to invest a lot of money to help him achieve such a career. If such a thing could be done, Li Yundong would definitely be recorded in history. He would become the object of admiration for countless people. As the saying goes, medicine carries the Tao and martial arts defend the Tao. If he wanted to make the world revere him, he had to rely on martial arts. But if he wanted to make the world admire him and sing his praises, he had to rely on the power of medicine. Lin Guiying and her husband had started from scratch and taken the lead in building the current country. She had seen all the vicissitudes of life, so she naturally knew that everything in the world was nothing more than fame and fortune. Some people sought profit, so there was a saying that all the people in the world came for profit. Some people sought fame, so there was a saying that people wanted to please the public and fish for fame. As long as the thing that Lin Guiying mentioned was done, he would definitely gain both fame and fortune. Who in the world wouldn't be tempted? However, not only did Li Yundong not show the slightest desire for quick success, but he also stood in Lin Guiying's position and sincerely persuaded her. This made Lin Guiying think more highly of Li Yundong. The elder, who had lived for 70 or 80 years, looked at Li Yundong with a moved expression. She seemed to want to see the slightest hypocrisy and politeness in Li Yundong's face and eyes. She had been wandering all her life and had seen countless things and people. She had long developed a pair of extremely sharp eyes. She was confident that she could see through a person's inner qualities at a glance. But Lin Guiying looked at Li Yundong carefully, only to see sincerity in his eyes. She didn't see any impetuosity or utilitarianism. Lin Guiying let out a long sigh in her heart and thought, "This is a gentleman who can entrust his life and death to me." As she was thinking, she couldn't help but glance at Chris. She sighed softly in her heart, feeling a little sorry for her granddaughter. Although Lin Guiying had been wandering abroad in her early years and spent most of her life abroad, she was still influenced by the traditional culture of China. She was very strict with her family and had always believed that wealth and honor could be passed down to the family for no more than 3 generations. Farming and reading could be passed down to the family for no more than 5 generations. Poetry could be passed down to the family for no more than 7 generations. And morality could be passed down to the family for no more than 10 generations. The history of China had proved this point countless times. The once incomparably rich businessmen and rich people had long been submerged in the rolling mortal world of history. Even those who were good at farming and reading had been submerged in the changes of the historical dynasties. Only the families of Zhang Tianshi and Confucius, who were good at Tao and virtue, had been passed down to this day, forming a beautiful story of Zhang in the south and Confucius in the north. Li Yundong in front of her was a man who cultivated Tao and had virtue. Since ancient times, men who had Tao and virtue had been respected. A wise man could see the world from bits and pieces, and a prophet could know the autumn from the falling leaves. From such a small thing, Lin Guiying could see that Li Yundong was a gentleman who could entrust big things to her. She was in awe and made up her mind to let her granddaughter follow Li Yundong. At the same time, she would do her best to help his career. However, although Lin Guiying was respectful in her heart, there was no difference on her face. She just laughed and said, "Zhenren, you worry too much. I have been in the United States for so many years, so I have some understanding of the current situation here. In the early years, the medical industry in the United States could be said to be controlled and monopolized by pharmaceutical companies. These drugs were the cash cows of the world's richest people. Even their wealth could be compared with that of oil tycoons." Li Yundong nodded. In addition to robbery, there was also selling medicine. It can be seen that selling medicine is really one of the most profitable businesses in the world. Lin Guiying smiled slightly and said, "Yes, at that time the entire medical system in the United States was linked to politics and laws. If a patient was unwilling to accept their treatment, the local court would immediately intervene and enforce it. I remember that there used to be a chemical called Ritalin. It was advertised that it could help school children learn and make them excellent in both character and study. Therefore, some local governments determined that any school child who wanted to take this medicine had to take it. If they didn't take it, they would not be allowed to go to school. If the parents came forward to negotiate, the parents would be prosecuted, sentenced, fined, and put in jail. As she said this, Lin Guiying sighed softly. At that time, 60% of American students took this medicine. I don't know if it was useful or not, but its side effects were to make students depressed, decadent, and in serious cases even commit suicide. Some people simply became very hot-tempered and stabbed themselves, killing their parents, grandparents, classmates, teachers, and principals. According to the figures released by the state, there were at least 150,000 Americans who were disabled or killed because of taking this chemical every year. Now that I think about it, it was really an unbearable memory. It was also because of this that I asked my child to withdraw from the public school system and go to a private school. Later, this kind of thing aroused the anger of American citizens. As you said, the book Confessions of a Medical Rebel written by Mandelson caused a sensation after it was published in the United States 80 years ago. Americans began to reflect deeply and set up the National Health Alliance. Although such a phenomenon has disappeared now, Americans are more and more aware that their own Western medicine is actually not a life-saving cure. They are eager for a truly green, natural, environmentally friendly, and harmless medical method that can keep them away from diseases and keep them healthy and live a long life. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He said, "Senior Lin, do you mean, now is the best time to introduce traditional Chinese medicine to the United States?" Lin Guiying laughed. Jinren Li, although Americans advocate science and have always despised traditional Chinese medicine, in fact, traditional Chinese medicine has been introduced to the United States for a long time. When Nixon visited China, he had received acupuncture in China. After returning to China, he praised it greatly. After that, many political celebrities received acupuncture treatment in Chinatown. As a result, the diseases that had not been cured for many years were immediately cured, and those who were paralyzed could stand up and walk. These things immediately caused a wave of acupuncture in the United States. Later, the United States legalized the practice of acupuncture. Gradually, the American medical community gradually opened up and adopted a non-interference policy, allowing patients to choose their own way of seeing a doctor. Li Yundong was surprised. There's such a thing? So traditional Chinese medicine should be doing well in the United States now? Lin Guiying shook her head and said, although there are about 20,000 practitioners in the United States who are engaged in acupuncture treatment, traditional Chinese medicine is not only about acupuncture. Acupuncture can't cure all diseases. More Americans use acupuncture just for curiosity, not because they trust traditional Chinese medicine. We still have a long way to go. Li Yundong pondered for a while, then looked up and said, "Senior Lin, do you mean that Americans just lack such an opportunity and place to get to know real traditional Chinese medicine? In fact, the environment for traditional Chinese medicine to enter the United States is ripe, right?" Lin Guiying smiled and said, "Yes. Now Americans are in urgent need of a green treatment method, and traditional Chinese medicine is very suitable for their needs. As long as you are willing to do this, I am willing to do my best to help you." While Li Yunyang and Lin Guiying were talking, Chris, Su Chan, and Ziyuan were listening quietly. They didn't dare to breathe too loudly. They knew that this might be something that could change the world, and it was such a thing that they could witness and even participate in the future. Li Yundong pursed his lips tightly and frowned unconsciously. After a long time, he raised his head and said to Lin Guiying, "Senior Lin, this matter is too big. I can't give you an answer now. I have to go back and think about it." Lin Guiying was not disappointed at all. She knew that if Li Yundong agreed rashly, she would be worried. At this time, careful consideration was a sign of maturity. Lin Guiying smiled and said, "It's okay. As long as I'm alive, my promise is valid. Even if I'm gone one day, I will ask my children to help you as much as possible." Li Yundong laughed and said, "Senior Lin, you can live for at least another 50 years. Lin Guiying blinked and said the name of a song quite wittily, 50 years is not enough. I really want to live for another 500 years. These words made everyone burst into laughter, and the banquet ended in a joyous manner. After the banquet, Li Yundong took Su Chan, Ziyuan, and Chris on their way back. Because Chris was a Yin spirit, she didn't have any documents with her, so it was naturally impossible for her to take a plane. Ziyuan, Su Chan, and Li Yundong were all unregistered residents, so they definitely didn't have passports. Therefore they could only fly back to Tianan City. Fortunately, Li Yundong had helped Ziyuan and Su Chan along the way with his unparalleled jinqi. Otherwise, with the strength of their jinqi, they would definitely be exhausted to the point of vomiting blood when they flew back to China. When they finally got home, it was already the evening of the next day. They returned home travel-worn. At this time, Zhou Qin was still in seclusion, and the little foxes had not returned from the tea shop of Desangxian. The house was empty and extremely quiet. After Chris's Ean spirit returned to her body, she fell on the sand tiredly. Her eyes were wide open and she looked up at the ceiling. No one knew what she was thinking. In order not to disturb Zhou Qin, Li Yundong turned around and entered Ziyuan's room. Su Chan loved cleanliness. As soon as she got home, she went into the bathroom and took a bath happily. At this time, Ziyuan saw that there was no one around, so she pulled Li Yundong aside and whispered, "Li Yundong, are you going to accept Senior Lin's proposal?" Li Yundong thought for a moment and sighed softly. "This game is too big. I'm afraid that Senior Lin can't handle it alone. This requires a huge amount of manpower and material resources. It's definitely not enough with just the few of us." Ziyuan nodded secretly. She had thought more deeply than Li Yundong. In her opinion, even if Lin Guiying's family could handle the whole thing, it would still be inappropriate. Because in that case, Lin Guiying's family would occupy a great position in the future when Li Yundong built up the country, and they might even take the initiative. Although this idea was a little harsh, Lin Guiying could help Li Yundong wholeheartedly and selflessly. Chris could do the same, but who could guarantee that the rest of the family would think the same? Who could guarantee that they would not be tempted after the huge benefits of this matter were shown? Ziyuan advised softly, "Li Yundong, you have to think about accepting a few special disciples. In the cultivation world, which great Jinren or martial artist doesn't accept famous and rich people as their disciples? Only when there are many disciples can you cultivate and preach." Li Yundong nodded secretly and agreed with Ziyuan's words very much in his heart. He glanced at Ziyuan and saw her concerned look, as if she was a virtuous wife earnestly telling her husband. His heart skipped a beat, and he couldn't help but look at Ziyuan with a different expression. Ziyuan seemed to notice Li Yundong's strange gaze. Her cheeks turned slightly red and she turned her head shyly. Just as she was about to get up and leave, she heard a knock on the door. Ziyuan immediately turned around and walked quickly to the door. When she opened it, she saw a slim and graceful girl standing opposite her. Her back was facing her and she was looking at the opposite door. Ziyuan asked curiously, "Who are you looking for?" As soon as the girl turned around, Ziyuan immediately recognized her. It was the daughter of the Shin family, Shin Hui. "Shin Hui? What can I do for you?" Ziyuan asked. Shin Hui's face was no longer as lively and shrewd as before. Her face was full of melancholy. She crossed her hands in front of her and pinched her fingers together. She lowered her head, turned around and said in a low voice, "Sister Ziyuan. Li Yun. Is Immortal Li at home?" Chapter 777. Immortal Li? Hearing Shin Hui's words, Ziyuan couldn't help but smile. She turned her face to look at Li Yundong in the room and said with a teasing smile, "Immortal Li, someone is looking for you." Li Yundong walked out and saw that it was Shin Hui. He smiled and said, "It's you. Come in and sit down." Shin Hui stood at the door with her hands clasped together. She lowered her head and hesitated for a while before raising it. She said anxiously and earnestly, "Immortal Li, can I ask you for a favor?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "What's the matter? Come in and talk. Besides, what can you ask me for?" Shin Hui knew that she had made things difficult for Li Yundong again and again, so it was naturally impossible for him to have a good impression of her. She bit her lip and tears kept rolling in her eyes. She begged in a low voice, "Immortal Li, I know you hate me, but for the sake of human life, please let bygones be bygones and help me." As she said this, she bent her knees and was about to kneel on the ground. Li Yundong quickly held her up, frowned secretly and said very seriously, "First of all, you can call me Li Yundong but don't call me Immortal Li. I'm just an ordinary person, not an immortal. Secondly, if you don't tell me what it is, how can I help you? Thirdly, what happened before was just a misunderstanding. There is no unresolvable grudge between me and you. Let bygones be bygones. Finally, your father Chen Wankai and I can be considered friends despite the difference in age. I am indebted to him for looking up to me and taking care of me in some matters. Even if it is for his sake, I will still help as much as I can. Get up quickly. What era is this? Why are you kneeling so easily? Really, who would believe that you are the daughter of the Shin family?" Shin Hui wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and got up with the help of Li Yundong. She originally had a baby face and her appearance was pretty and delicate. Although she was petite, her figure was very hot. It could be said that she had an angel's face and a devil's figure. She looked like a pear blossom in tears. Even Ziyuan, who was beside her, couldn't help but come forward to comfort her softly and persuade her with kind words, not to mention Li Yundong, who had always had tender and protective feelings for women. After Li Yundong asked Shen Hui to sit down on the sofa in the living room, he took a serious look at the girl in front of him. He couldn't help but associate the timid and sad girl in front of him with the shrewd girl he had met in the clothing store for the first time. The two images were so different that Li Yundong couldn't help but shake his head secretly. He thought to himself, it's really fate. Who would have thought that the daughter of the Shen family in front of me is the shrewd little girl who scolded people indiscriminately? Li Yundong saw that after Shen Hui sat down on the sand, she just secretly shed tears but never spoke. He knew that the girl was reserved after all and might be embarrassed to open her mouth, so he took the initiative to say, Shen Hui, why did you come to me? Is someone sick? When Shen Hui heard this, she immediately raised her head and nodded gently. Li Yundong was stunned. He thought for a moment and said, your father, Shen Wankai? No way. He took the medicine I gave him so he should be in good health. Shen Hui shook her head bitterly. It's not my father. Li Yundong nodded slightly. That's right. If he took my medicine and got sick, then someone must have done something to him behind his back. It's not a trivial matter. Shen Hui's body trembled slightly, and her fingers clenched together tighter. Li Yundong asked again, is that your mother? In Li Yundong's opinion, Shen Hui must have knelt down and begged him because her close family was seriously ill and helpless, so she came to him. But to Li Yundong's surprise, Shen Hui shook her head and said, no, it's Auntie Li. Auntie Li? Li Yundong asked curiously, which Auntie Li? Shen Hui raised her head and looked at Li Yundong timidly, as if she was afraid that he would be angry. She stammered, it's Shen Yu's mother? Shen Yu? When Li Yundong heard the name, he frowned and asked in confusion, oh, you mean Mrs. Li? Why is she seriously ill? Shen Hui said hesitantly, after Shen Yu was kicked out of the house by the old master, I don't know where he went. Auntie Li misses him day and night and doesn't want to eat or drink. Now, she's dying. Li Yundong looked at Shen Hui strangely and subconsciously wanted to ask, hasn't this Auntie Li always been against you? If she's gone, wouldn't it be more convenient for you to take over Shen Wansai's property? But this question was too heart-wrenching. He could only think about it, not say it. But Shen Hui was also the daughter of a rich family, and she had lived in an environment of intrigue since she was a child. Li Yundong just glanced at her strangely, and she understood what he was thinking. Shen Hui explained in a low voice, I know you will find it strange. Why did I ask you to save Auntie Li? My mother also told me not to save her, but I watched such a beautiful person, such a charming woman, lose weight bit by bit in front of my eyes, die bit by bit, I really couldn't stand it. As she spoke, Shen Hui's fingers were tightly twisted together. She raised her head and her big eyes were full of tears. She choked and said, I'm so scared, I'm really scared. I've never felt that this family is so cold and cruel as I do now. My father cut off my brother and his son. My mother gritted her teeth and cursed Auntie Li behind her back. Even my father didn't let me find a doctor to treat her. I don't know. I really don't know why our family has such a deep hatred. Why do we want to kill each other? Why is it like this? At this point, Shen Hui couldn't help but burst into tears. I know, Li Yundong, it's my brother, Shen Yu, who let you down, but the old master has already cut off one of his hands. Can this be considered as writing off the grudge? I really can't stand it. Although Auntie Li doesn't usually treat me well, I see such a big family, and now everyone wants her to die. I'm scared, I'm so scared. I'm afraid that one day I'll end up like her, lying on the bed alone, waiting to die, and no one outside wants to save me. Everyone is looking forward to my death. Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, let out a long sigh. She couldn't help but gently hold her in her arms and comfort her in a low voice. Li Yundong's face was as dark as water, and he was silent. After a long time he got up and sighed. Good luck, it's really good luck. Before I started cultivating, I stayed at home all day, hating and envying those rich second generations. Now it seems that I know how terrible the ways of the world are in a big rich family. Li Yundong shook his head and said, although Shen Yu is a scumbag, his family should not be harmed. I didn't expect that his mother would end up like this. I have some responsibility. But don't worry, I will definitely save her. Shen Hui was overjoyed. She looked at Li Yundong with tears in her eyes and said in a trembling voice, are you willing to save her? Even my father refused to let her go. Are you willing to let her go? Li Yundong sighed and said, there is no hatred in the world that can't be solved. Why wouldn't I save her? I don't know what old Master Shin is thinking. How could he implicate Shin Yu's mother? After Shin Hui had experienced a series of great changes in her family, her original arrogant and domineering temperament had also been restrained a lot. She had become cautious and introverted. Although she was dissatisfied with her father, she still understood the truth that a son should not talk about his father. She quickly wiped her tears and said in a choked voice, "Then when are we going?" Li Yundong said, "Saving people is like putting out a fire. We can't delay for even a second. Let's go now." As he said this, Li Yundong nodded to Ziyuan. "Ziyuan, your medical skills are also very good. Come with me." Ziyuan nodded slightly. She hesitated for a moment and asked softly, "Should we call Su-chan? If there is any grudge we can resolve it in person." Li Yundong thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, "Forget it. She is still taking a bath. This matter can't be delayed. Maybe if we go a step earlier we can save a life. If we go a step later we will be helpless." Ziyuan knew that this was just an excuse. With Li Yundong's ability, even if a person had just died, he could still save this person and bring her back to life for a while. He just didn't want Su-chan to be embarrassed when she arrived at the Shin family. Ziyuan nodded and stopped talking about this matter. She turned around and went out with Li Yundong. When the three of them walked to the stairwell, Li Yundong suddenly stopped and said to Ziyuan, "By the way, call Chris. It's time for her to start learning about cultivation." Ziyuan smiled slightly and turned to enter Li Yundong's room. Not long after, Chris rushed out from inside, biting a card in her mouth. Her hands were behind her, and she was busy coiling up her wet golden hair. Li Yundong smiled and walked over to take her hands down. He gently brushed his palm over her head and said with a smile, "You don't need to coil it up. Let's go." Chris touched her back, only to find that her wet hair was now dry as usual. She was secretly speechless and didn't dare to ask more. She draped her long golden hair over her shoulders like a waterfall and obediently followed behind Li Yundong. She glanced at Shin Hui and greeted her politely. Shin Hui secretly glanced at Chris. She didn't understand why Li Yundong wanted to take a blonde girl to her home, but she didn't dare to say much. She just quietly led the way. When the group of people arrived at the Shin family's villa by car, it was already about 8 o'clock in the evening. Logically speaking, this time should be the time when all the households were brightly lit and the most lively and warm. However, at this time, the Shin family's house was dark, and there was a dead silence all around. It was a sharp contrast with the last time Li Yundong and the others had come to the Shin family's house. Li Yundong only took a glance and shook his head in his heart. After they followed Shin Hui into the villa, they found that the hall was also dark. After Shin Hui turned on the light, the housekeeper came out. "Who is it?" After the housekeeper asked, he was surprised to find that Li Yundong and the others were behind Shin Hui. He opened his mouth and said, "Shall we uke?" Shin Hui made a silent gesture to him and said in a low voice, "Uncle Zhang, don't talk. I'll take." Immortal Li and Immortal Ziyuan to see Auntie Li. A strange look flashed across Butler Zhang's eyes. He retreated to the side and didn't say anything. Li Yundong followed Shin Hui upstairs and came to the innermost small room. After pushing the door open, Li Yundong took a look inside and was immediately shocked. Chapter 778. When Li Yundong first saw Shin Yu's mother, Li Shaoxian, it was in the reception hall of the Longmen building in Dongwu City. At that time, Li Shaoxian was dressed in luxurious fur and jewelry. Although the child was in her 20s, she looked no different from a young girl in her 20s. She could be called a beautiful woman with outstanding temperament and outstanding beauty. No wonder Shin Wankai doted on her so much. But at this time in front of Li Yunyang, Li Shaoxian was lying on the bed. Her black hair had become dry and pale, and her skin, which was as delicate as a young girl, was full of wrinkles. Her watery eyes were also deeply sunken at this time, leaving only 2 empty eyeballs embedded in them. She was motionless as if she had died. If Li Yundong hadn't found that she was still breathing slightly, he would have thought that this once beautiful woman had died. At this time, Li Shaoxian was like a living mummy. Her appearance was like a skeleton which made people feel terrified and creepy. Although Li Yundong didn't like this woman very much, he couldn't bear to see her like this at this time. He sighed softly. He turned his head and whispered to Shin Hui, "How did she become like this?" Shin Hui sighed softly and said, "After Shin Yu was driven out of the house by the old master that day, Auntie Li sent someone to look for his whereabouts in private, but they couldn't find him. Auntie Li was heartbroken. She missed her son every day and didn't eat anything. Now she has slowly become like this." Li Yundong frowned and said, "She doesn't eat." You can inject her with glucose and give her liquid food. Isn't this letting her die on her own? Shen Hui sighed and said, at first the housekeeper Uncle Zhang thought so too, but when he wanted to help Auntie Li hit him like crazy and said that if he did this again she would commit suicide. Uncle Zhang was afraid that she would commit suicide, so he had to let her go on like this. Li Yundong frowned again and asked, what about Mr. Shen? He doesn't care? Although Mrs. Li doesn't have a title, she has shared the same bed with him for 20 years. Is he so heartless? Shen Hui glanced at Li Yundong and said hesitantly, no, it's not like that. It's. Li Yundong asked, is it because Mr. Shen blames Li Shaoxian for not teaching Shen Yu well? Shen Hui hesitated for a moment and nodded, but soon shook her head. Li Yundong frowned and was unhappy in his heart. He wanted to ask again, but at this time he heard a low laugh behind him. It was Chen Wankai who had heard the news and rushed over. Young Master Li and Fairy Ziyuan are here. Why didn't you inform me in advance? I could have gone out to welcome you. When Chen Wankai appeared at the door, his face was full of smiles, but his eyebrows were full of melancholy. His white hair was trembling as if he had aged more than 10 years. Seeing him like this, the dissatisfaction in Li Yundong's heart weakened a little. He sighed secretly, smiled slightly and said to Shen Wankai, Mr. Shen, you are still so polite. Chen Wankai looked around quickly. When he saw Shen Hui, who was lowering her head timidly, and Li Shaoxian, who was behind her, he frowned secretly, but soon his brows relaxed again. He asked knowingly, what's the matter with young Master Li and Fairy Ziyuan today? Li Yundong looked at Shen Hui, who had lowered her head and was silent. He went straight to the point and said concisely, Shen Hui asked me to treat Mrs. Li. Chen Wankai glanced at Shen Hui, and a meaningful look flashed in his eyes. Before he could speak, Aunt Zheng, who was beside him, suddenly opened her mouth and scolded in a low voice, Shen Hui, what are you doing? Come here. The third concubine, Aunt Zheng, had been fighting with Li Shaoxian for more than 10 years, and now the winner had finally been decided. Not only had she seen Li Shaoxian lose Shen Wancai's strongest weapon in the incident of Shen Yu, but she had also pointed out that Li Shaoxian had poured out all of Shen Wancai's medicine in an attempt to kill Shen Wankai. It was also because of this matter that Chen Wankai was furious, and it became the last straw that completely crushed Li Shaoxian. Her third brother had finally defeated her fourth brother, and the east wind had finally overwhelmed the west wind. These days the third concubine could be said to be proud and proud. Not only did she form a sharp contrast with Li Shaoxian, who was as thin as a match, but even when standing next to Chen Wankai, who was more than 10 years older, her face was still flushed. Shen Hui lowered her head and slowly moved to Aunt Zheng. As soon as she approached, her mother scolded, you unfilial thing. You know that the old master hates this bitch to the bone, but you still saved her. Do you want to anger the old master to death? As she said this, she raised her hand and slapped Shen Hui in the face. Li Yundong was furious in his heart. He raised his hand and grabbed the arm of the third concubine. He said in a deep voice, Mrs. Zheng, if you have something to say, let's talk about it. Why did you hit me? Although the third concubine was unhappy, she thought, I disciplined my daughter. What does it have to do with you? But she also knew that the boy in front of her was no small matter. If it weren't for him, the Shen family would never have become like this, and she would never have been able to defeat Li Shaoxian. The third concubine quickly smiled and said, Young Master Li, you don't know. Our Shen Yu used to be too lax in discipline, so now he has become like this. Although I am not Shen Yu's biological mother, I am also very sad that such a thing has happened to my family. You tell me, if I don't discipline my daughter strictly, how can I do it? Beating is a sign of love and scolding is a sign of love. Only now do I understand this sentence. If I had understood it earlier and told Shaoxian earlier, I don't think Shen Yu would have embarked on such a road of no return. Alas, it's all my fault. As she spoke, she couldn't help but raise her hand to wipe her wet eyes. Shen Hui, who was standing to one side, also cried. She grabbed her hand and cried in a low voice, Mom, I will be obedient. Don't worry, I will be filial to you. Li Yundong saw that her words were reasonable, but after thinking about it carefully, almost every word was directed at Li Shaoxian. She was pointing at the mulberry tree, scolding the locust tree and adding insult to injury. Li Yundong looked at her meaningfully. He was secretly unhappy, but he also knew that it was difficult for an upright official to settle a family feud. He didn't want to get involved in the Shen family's affairs. Li Yundong just nodded to Shen Wankai and asked, Mr. Shen, Mrs. Li has become like this today, and it has something to do with me. Although she is also at fault, it is not as bad as death. I want to give her another chance. What do you think? Shen Wankai sighed deeply. He said to Li Yundong, "Young Master Li, can I have a word with you?" Li Yundong nodded and followed Shen Wankai to a nearby study. As soon as he entered the door, Shen Wankai said in a deep voice, "Young Master Li, you must be blaming me in your heart, saying that I am unreasonable and mean, right?" Li Yundong had always been an open and above-board person. He did not refute it but nodded straightforwardly and said, "Yes. After all, she is the person who has lived with you for more than 20 years. Shen Wankai smiled bitterly, reached out his hand and motioned for Li Yundong to sit down. He slowly sat down, leaned tiredly against the back of the chair and said wearily, "Young Master Li, to tell you the truth, when you saved me, I knew what Xiaoxian had done. If you hadn't saved me at that time, I'm afraid I would have been killed by her. But at that time, for the sake of her hard work bringing up Shenyu, I thought, everyone makes mistakes. As long as I know my mistakes and can change them, I will pretend that I have never been born." But, you know what happened next? Rome wasn't built in a day. Speaking of which, Xiaoxian and I both have an unshirkable responsibility for your becoming such a cruel and arrogant person. Shen Wankai said slowly, "Of course, this is not the reason why I want to force Xiaoxian to die. It's because Xiaoxian hates me in her heart. She just wants to die in front of me, make me regret it for the rest of my life, and make me unable to live in peace for the rest of my life." Li Yundong frowned and said, "But I heard from Xin Hui that you didn't ask someone to find a doctor for Mrs. Li?" Shen Wankai laughed. He raised his head and looked at Li Yundong meaningfully. "Young Master Li, you saw what my third brother said just now. Hey, there's a hidden meaning in his words." Before one wave had subsided, another wave had arisen. "Young Master Li, think about it from my point of view. I only have Huier left to inherit the family business, and she has such a scheming mother. If I pass the family business to her when I really get old or I'm gone, will she do something unbearable under her mother's instigation?" Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, and then suddenly realized something. "So, are you testing Shen Hui?" Shen Wankai nodded heavily. "Yes. If she can really make up her mind not to save Xiaoxian, then I would rather give my family business to charity in the future than pass it on to her." Li Yundong sighed. "This family of yours. It's really difficult." Shen Wankai smiled bitterly. "That's why I have the idea of seeking Tao. Young Master Li, I know that you are a master of Tao and I am so devout about Tao. Why are you not willing to accept me as a disciple? Is it because you still hate Su Chan in your heart?" Li Yundong shook his head. "No, this matter is over. The reason why I don't accept you as a disciple is because you haven't answered me. Why on earth do you cultivate Tao?" At this time Shen Wankai stood up and knelt on the ground. He said, "Young Master Li, I heard that Luan, the king of Huainan in the Western Han dynasty, was devoted to Tao. One day he heard that there was an immortal named Duke Ba who had the secret recipe for refining elixirs of immortality, but he never passed it on to others, so he went to find Duke Ba. Unexpectedly, Duke Ba wandered around, and Luan suffered a lot but still failed to find him. But Luan still searched wholeheartedly, and finally, Duke Ba was moved by Luan's sincerity. One day, Duke Ba came to Luan's house and taught him the method of refining elixirs of immortality. He also told Luan that once the elixir of immortality was refined, he would be able to ascend to heaven and become an immortal after eating it. Luan devoutly cultivated every day and later he really refined the elixir of immortality. After he took the elixir of immortality, his chickens and dogs ate the dregs of the elixir and also ascended to immortality along with Luan. Shen Wansai's white hair trembled slightly. He said excitedly, "Young Master Li, when I first met you, I knew that you were not an ordinary person, and that you would definitely have a great career in the future. Later I found out that young Master Li is a genius of the world with the skills of immortals. I, Shen Wankai, know that my fortune is shallow, and I do not seek to cultivate amazing magic, nor do I seek to become a famous master in the world. I only seek to live a long life. Young Master Li, you asked me why I cultivate Tao and my answer is..." As he said this he kowtowed deeply. "I only wish to be a chicken or dog that ascends to heaven." Group 5 is full. Everyone don't add any more. Group 6 is now open. 94450337. Chapter 779. Chen Wankai wholeheartedly pursued the Tao, but his mind was not pure. Although he only wanted to live a long life, in fact, Li Yundong knew very well that he was reluctant to give up the glory and wealth of the world and wanted to enjoy it for a few more years. Since ancient times, no matter how the dynasties changed and the times changed, those who believed in God and Buddha and longed for longevity were always the rich and powerful. Who would be willing to give up the luxurious life in the world? Many emperors of all dynasties longed for immortality because they were not willing to hold supreme power in their hands. However, they still had to live, grow old, get sick and die like ordinary people. If it was an ordinary person who lived a bitter life, who would desire immortality and suffering. However, those who lived a little more comfortable life longed to live 100 years. The higher the official, the more money they had, the more they hoped that they would not die. This was also the reason why Taoist Li Yi held a health class in society, and it immediately attracted countless rich people to join it. In theory, there was no difference between Qin Huangkai and these people. However, the person he was pursuing was Li Yundong, a rising star who was famous in the cultivation world but unknown in society. The other rich people were pursuing Li Yi, who only knew how to cheat money and women. Li Yundong had always set a standard that was, his disciples must wholeheartedly pursue the Tao. This Tao must be a devout belief in Taoism and have no distracting thoughts in their hearts. Only in this way could they achieve positive results. In other words, Li Yundong hoped that his disciples would all be great figures in the future, so that he would not lose face. However, gradually, under the influence of Ziyuan, Li Yundong also knew that it was almost impossible to achieve this. Everyone had their own selfish feelings. Those who had no selfishness were saints. Since they were saints, they could write books and establish their own sections. Why should they cultivate with him? As the saying goes, if a person is too scrupulous, there will be no disciples, and if the water is too clear, there will be no fish. Li Yundong also realized that if he always insisted on this point of view, he was afraid that he could only accept Zhou Qin as his disciple in this life. Although Zhou Qin's talent and opportunity were not inferior to his, he only had one disciple. If he established a sect in the future, he would be laughed at by others. Li Yundong understood this, so he no longer forced the other party to reveal his desire to seek the Tao. As long as the other party was not a wicked person, had a good heart, had opportunities and had talent, then he could consider it. It was not the first time that Qin Huangkai had made such a big bow in front of Li Yundong. Moreover, he was dozens of years older than Li Yundong. Li Yundong was really a little embarrassed to be begged and kowtowed by a man of his father's generation. He reached out to help Qin Huangkai up and said, "Mr. Qin, please get up first." Qin Huangkai shook his head stubbornly. "Young Master Li, if you don't agree, I won't get up today." Li Yundong hadn't expected that the boss of a group would be so shameless. He couldn't help laughing and said, "Mr. Qin, how can you cultivate with me if you kneel on the ground?" Qin Huangkai raised his head in surprise, and his voice trembled with ecstasy. "Young Master Li, you agree?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "Mr. Qin, I am not an unreasonable person. Since you have said so, I have no reason to disagree. However, although I promise you, I can only accept you as a nominal disciple for now, just like Chris." Chris. Qin Huangkai was slightly stunned, but then he reacted. "Is it the foreigner who came with you, young Master Li?" Li Yundong nodded. "That's right." Qin Huangkai stood up with Li Yundong's help. He smiled cautiously and said, "Li, Master, has your disciple been sent abroad? She's really amazing." Li Yundong smiled and said, "She is also a fated person and part of her blood is Chinese. You can talk to her in private. Her Chinese language is very good. Let's not talk about it now. Let's go save Li Shaoxian first." Qin Huangkai nodded and sighed softly. "If a person has the intention to commit suicide, I'm afraid that even if you are a real immortal, you can only save her for a while, not for a lifetime." Li Yundong thought for a moment and said, "That's better than not saving her." Qin Huangkai sighed and said, "Master, you are really kind. Nowadays people only care about their own interests. They don't care about the lives of others. What's more, Shaoxian has more or less offended you in the past." Li Yundong waved his hand and said, "Don't mention it." With that, he turned around and went out of the door, returning to Li Shaoxian's room. Although Qin Huangkai was the emperor of his family and company, he carefully adjusted his role in front of Li Yundong. He followed Li Yundong step by step, neither too far behind nor too far ahead. After entering the room, Qin Huangkai saw Chris standing quietly to the side. He stepped forward and bowed slightly, saying with a smile, "Hello, Shiji." When Chris heard him, a figure of her father's generation, call her Shiji, she also felt strange in her heart. She replied with a strange expression, "Hello, hello." The two of them, who were quite different in age, greeted each other and turned to look at Li Yundong. At this time, Li Yundong walked up to Li Shaoxian and reached out to feel her pulse. As soon as his hand touched Li Shaoxian's skin, Li Shaoxian's whole body trembled. Then, her two deeply sunken eyeballs moved abruptly, as if a dead person had come back to life. Her originally empty eyes also had a strange color in an instant. She raised her trembling hand and pointed at Li Yundong, struggling to say, I don't want to see you. Get out. Shen Hui, who was standing to one side, couldn't help but say anxiously, Auntie Li, young master is here to save you. Li Shaoxian hadn't eaten for many days and had long been starving. At this time she spoke weakly and her voice was light. I don't want him to save me. Go, all of you go. Let me die. Don't you all want me to die? Shen Hui was in a hurry to say more, but her mother, who was beside her, was secretly anxious. She was a little disappointed and scolded in her heart. Is this girl crazy today? Why does she always do bad things with good intentions? I don't know how this little B***tch used to make things difficult for us. Do you still want to save her? Have you heard of the story of the farmer and the snake? But these words could only be thought in her heart, and she absolutely could not say it. The third concubine remained calm. She grabbed Shen Hui with one hand and pinched her hard, but she advised, fourth sister, don't take it too hard. As the saying goes, even ants want to live, let alone. Before she finished speaking, Li Shaoxian didn't know where she got the strength from, but she glared at her fiercely. The fourth concubine's eyes were originally sunken like a skeleton. When she glared at her, her eyeballs seemed to fall out. She looked extremely terrible, and the third concubine was so scared that she took a step back. No matter what, she couldn't say anything else. Li Shaoxian gasped violently, and her chest was like a bellows. She said breathlessly, get out of here. Don't say such hypocritical words here. The third concubine was furious. She subconsciously wanted to curse, but she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. She turned her head and said to Shen Wankai in a sobbing tone, Old master, look this. Before she could finish her words, Shen Wankai looked at her coldly. That cold gaze only made the rest of her words freeze in her mouth, and she didn't dare to say them. Li Jiandong saw that their family did not forget to scheme against each other at this critical juncture. The women around Shen Wankai were really not easy to deal with. He couldn't help but think of Su Chan, Ziyuan, Zhou Qin, and the others around him. He sighed in his heart, not only am I lucky in love, but I also have a personal disciple and a confidant. They are very considerate and never fight openly or secretly. Although the little girl sometimes causes a little trouble, she is simple, naive, and kind, and never gets involved in these things of jealousy. God is really kind to me. Li Jiandong sighed in his heart. He calmed down and said to Li Shaoxian, Mrs. Li, I know you have resentment in your heart, but did we cause all this? If a person makes a mistake, he must pay the price. This is the consequence, and there is a reason why a person can come to this point today. If you give up on yourself like this, you are simply avoiding your own mistakes and responsibilities. You can't find Xinyu now, but have you ever thought that if one day Xinyu suddenly learns from his mistakes and turns over a new leaf, but you have already given up on yourself and are no longer in the world? How do you expect him to face all this? Won't he go back to the crooked path? Li Jiandong said earnestly, Mrs. Li, you have worked hard to raise your child. I can understand your sadness and grief, but I don't think you want the child you raised to become an evil person in the future, do you? Don't you want your child to be looked at in the eye and praised by others one day? If you want to cheer up first. I can save you for a while, but the only person who can save you for a lifetime will always be yourself. Listening to Li Jiandong's words, Li Xiaoxian's eyes were full of tears. Her lips trembled slightly, and after a long time she said in a trembling voice, Can I still see my Yuer? Li Jiandong said in a deep voice, That depends on whether you have a firm and persistent heart, Mrs. Li. Li Shaoxian choked with sobs and said, It's my fault. I didn't teach Yuer well. Immortally, I want to find my son and give him a chance to turn over a new leaf. I want to teach him well again. Please save me. Li Jiandong nodded slightly and gently pressed his hand between Li Xiaoxian's eyebrows. He said softly, It's good to know your mistakes and correct them. Mrs. Li, have a good rest. The Jinqi in his body slowly flowed into Li Xiaoxian's body. Li Xiaoxian only felt warm all over, and after a while she fell asleep. Chris, who was standing to one side, had seen Li Jiandong pull her grandmother back from the embrace of death in the blink of an eye. Moreover, she looked radiant and much younger. But now Li Jiandong only let Li Shaoxian fall asleep slowly, not like he had treated her grandmother. She couldn't help asking curiously, Master, why didn't you cure her? Chris had been with Li Jiandong and the others for a long time, and her Chinese had become more and more fluent. She was a blonde with blue eyes, and as soon as she opened her mouth, she spoke in standard Chinese, which naturally attracted the curious attention of Shen Wankai and the others. Li Jiandong looked at her with a smile and said, Chris? However, Chris suddenly interrupted Li Jiandong. She knelt down, raised her head and said seriously, "Master, I want to tell you that from today on, I will change my name to Lin Miao. Isn't this the Chinese name you gave me?" Li Jiandong looked at Chris meaningfully and said, "Then you have to understand that from now on, there will only be Lin Miao and there will be no Chris." Chris said this to Li Jiandong at this time, obviously to tell him that she wanted to concentrate on cultivation with Li Jiandong and asked him to accept her as a disciple. Li Jiandong's words were full of subtext. It was obvious that he was telling Chris that if she wanted to be a disciple, she had to abandon everything and wholeheartedly adapt to her new identity, Lin Miao. Chris bowed down seriously and said, "Yes, from now on, there will only be Lin Miao in this world and there will be no Chris." Li Jiandong looked at her with a smile and said, "Does your grandmother know?" Chris raised her head and smiled sweetly. Of course she knows. She also wants to be a disciple of Master. Li Jiandong laughed, reached out his hand and gently stroked her head. "Well, from today on you are Lin Miao." Chris knows she should be called Lin Miao now. She was overjoyed when she heard this. She kowtowed 3 times and called him Master. After she finished bowing, Li Jiandong stood up and nodded slightly to Chen Wankai, who was looking at him eagerly, and said, "Today I will teach you your first lesson." She knew that Lin Miao was extremely talented, and her physical body furnace was also 1 in a million. She had the advantages of the West but not the disadvantages of the West, and the advantages of the East but not the disadvantages of the East. Needless to say, she had not only been transformed by the Diuan Jindan, but also been able to become a disciple of the reincarnated Wisdom King. Such a person, what kind of achievements could she achieve in the future? She knew that Lin Miao was definitely not the first foreign female cultivator in the Chinese cultivation world. In the year 2000 before her, the Chuanjian Dragon sect had accepted a French blonde beauty as a disciple of the 32nd generation. Her Taoist name was Jing Xiu, and she was currently the president of the French Taoist Association. However, Jing Xiu did not have the opportunity and good fortune that Lin Miao had. Obviously, her future cultivation would not be as high as Lin Miao's. And this Lin Miao from the United States, would she surpass her? Would she surpass Wei Tsuanhua, the founder of the Shangqing sect, and Sun Bu'er, the founder of the Chuanjian Nanwu sect? What kind of changes would she bring to the cultivation world if she achieved such achievements in the future? The only thing she knew was that Li Jiandong had begun to show signs of Jin Lin is not a fish in the pond, and when he meets the wind and clouds, he will change into a dragon. As soon as he moved, the wind and clouds around him will move, and as soon as the wind and clouds move, the world will move. An idea suddenly came to Ziyuan's mind. She didn't know how far the man in front of her could go, but she wanted to stay by his side, quietly accompany him and see how far he could go. However, what Ziyuan didn't know was that a huge wave that would shake the entire cultivation world was about to sweep over. Alas, illness comes from the mouth. Today I was greedy. I ate cold loofah and bananas and my stomach rebelled again. What a tragedy, I'm writing in pain. In addition, Wei Tsuanhua and Sun Bu'er were both famous female cultivators in China's history. Wang Chongyang's 7 disciples, Ma Yu, the eldest of the Chuanjian 7 masters, was married to Sun Bu'er. As for Jing Xiu, she was also a real person. This French girl was quite beautiful. She had entered the Taoist sect in Xi'an, and now she should have returned to China to spread Taoism. Those who were traveling in France could go to the French Taoist Association to see this beauty. Chapter 780. In the Shun family's villa, Li Yundong taught cultivation to his 2 disciples for the first time. He said with confidence, "In your opinion, what is cultivation?" This question stunned both Lin Miao and Chen Wankai. The 2 of them looked at each other. It was not the first time they had met. At this time, because of the opportunity, they had gathered together, so there was a sense of closeness in their hearts. Lin Miao thought for a moment and said, "I think cultivation is a kind of hard cultivation so as to constantly improve one's strength." However, Chen Wankai said, "I think cultivating one's body and mind is cultivation." Li Yundong nodded and said, "You're both right but also wrong. In short, cultivation is to strengthen one's body and spirit through the method of cultivating one's body and mind. That is what the Taoists call dual cultivation of life and spirit. After strengthening one's body, one will have a power stronger than that of mortals. Just like when I saved your grandmother, Lin Miao. At that time your grandmother's soul was scattered everywhere. I used the power of a powerful magical weapon to pull her soul back and poured a lot of jinqi into your body. But your grandmother has been practicing martial arts all year round, and what she practices is the plum blossom fist, which is the closest to cultivation. Therefore her body is strong and her furnace is vigorous. She is not inferior to cultivators at all. It's just that she doesn't understand the way of cultivation and can't get started. Therefore, if I inject Jinqi into her, she can completely bear it. Li Yundong pointed to Li Shaoxian, who was sleeping soundly, and said, but she is just an ordinary human furnace, and she has been hungry for so many days. Her body is already weak. If I suddenly pour a lot of pure Jinqi into her, her meridians will definitely explode and she will die. As he said this, Li Yundong smiled at Lin Miao and said, you have to remember that although there are many magic arts in the world, they are all the same. The way of the Great Way depends on your heart. You have to adapt to the local conditions, the person, and the time. Lin Miao thought for a while and nodded slowly. However, Chen Wankai couldn't help asking, Master, is Shaoxian okay now? Li Yundong smiled and said, she is just weak. She will be fine after a little recuperation. As long as she doesn't want to die, of course, there will be no problem. Chen Wankai was relieved. He glanced at Li Shaoxian and asked, Master, isn't it a little late for me to cultivate at such an old age? Li Yundong thought for a while and looked at Xin Hui and the third concubine. He hesitated for a moment. The third concubine was very clever. She immediately pulled Xin Hui and said with a smile, you guys talk first. Weir and I will prepare some food. As she said this, she pulled Xin Hui out of the room. After coming out, the third concubine looked back. Although she was angry at Xin Hui for asking Li Yundong to save Li Shaoxian, she felt even more regretful that Xin Hui could not stay in the room at this time. She naturally knew that since her father had taken Li Yundong as his master, he would definitely be greatly influenced by him in the future. If her daughter could get close to Li Yundong, there would naturally be many benefits in the future. Thinking of this, the third concubine couldn't help complaining about Xin Hui. You stupid girl. I asked you to acknowledge me as your master in the past, but you didn't. Now, even if you want to acknowledge me as your master, I won't accept you. I'm so angry that I was kicked out of my own house. Xin Hui also looked gloomy. She looked at the room with a complicated look in her eyes. She opened her mouth and wanted to refute, but she couldn't say anything. She was silent for a while, feeling lost in her heart. At this time in the room, Li Yundong said to Xin Wankai, it's indeed a little late for you to cultivate now, but in history there are people who have cultivated at an old age. For example, Zhang Sanfeng, Wang Chongyang, and Ma Yu. These people are all old. Xin Wankai smiled bitterly and said, Master, I don't expect to cultivate to their level. Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, according to the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, the liver is weak at 7 or 8, and the tendons can't move. After 8 or 8 days the man is thirsty, the essence is little, the kidney is weak, and the body is extremely weak. The 7 or 8 and 8 refer to the two age gaps of 56 and 64 years old. At this stage, men have entered the stage of decline and are very unsuitable for cultivation. Xin Wankai was disappointed. Then, is there any other way? Li Yundong smiled and said, yes. Xin Wankai's eyes suddenly lit up. What is it? Li Yundong smiled and said, take pills and medicine to cultivate your body and mind. Even though Xin Wankai had seen a lot of the world, he couldn't help but be excited when he heard such a thing at this time. Like a teenager, he said with a face full of desire, what pills? What medicine? Is it the elixir of life? Master, do you know how to refine it? Li Yundong shook his head and said with a smile, I don't know and I can't refine it. Xin Wankai was shocked, and his face was full of disappointment. Ah, even you can't refine it? Li Yundong nodded slightly. Yes, but you can. Xin Wankai was stunned and then said with a wry smile, Master, don't joke. Li Yundong laughed and said, have you forgotten that you have the Medicine King tripod? Xin Wankai was stunned for a moment, and then he suddenly came to his senses. He rushed out like a gust of wind and rushed back like a gust of wind. He held the Medicine King tripod with both hands and respectfully held it over his head. He bent down and handed it to Li Yundong. Master, the Medicine King tripod is here. I will give it to you now as a fee for my entry. Li Yundong laughed and said, are you kidding me? 700 million yuan for the entry fee? Do you want to scare me to death? As he said this, he said to Lin Miao, can you afford such an entry fee? Lin Miao smiled bitterly and said, Master, don't play with me. Chen Wankai looked a little embarrassed as he said, Master, I was wrong, but this is a token of my sincerity. In my hands it's just an antique collection. In your hands it's a great magic treasure of immortals. If you let me hold it all the time, it's also a sin. As the saying goes, an ordinary man is innocent, but he gets into trouble because of his wealth. Master, you don't want to see me suffer a misfortune, do you? Xin Wansai's words were quite good. Li Yundong smiled. He was not pretentious, He nodded and said, "Okay, then I'll keep it for you for the time being. In the future when I refine the pills I'll give them to you." Seeing that Li Yundong had accepted the Medicine King tripod, Shen Wankai was relieved. Seeing that Li Yundong had finally taken the Medicine King tripod, Ziyuan was secretly happy for him. Now that the Medicine King tripod was in hand, as long as there were medicinal materials, with the alchemy skills she had learned, she and Li Yundong would not be afraid of having no pills to use in the near future. Even if one day they really had no money, they could also wholesale elixirs. This could also be a way to make money. Li Yundong didn't know what Ziyuan was thinking. He seriously taught Lin Miao and Shen Wankai the most basic cultivation knowledge, just like Ziyuan had taught him. In the past few days he had been going back and forth between the Shen family and his own home, teaching Lin Miao and Shen Wankai while helping Li Shaoxian take care of her body. Unknowingly it was already close to the end of the year. A southern city like Tianan City finally had a little chill. In the distant Mount Longhu in Jiangxi province, the approach of the Spring Festival made this place, which was full of outstanding people, feel like spring had arrived. Mount Longhu was surrounded by mountains and rivers, and there was plenty of water vapor. In recent years the temperature had been generally high. Although it was close to the end of the year, it had strangely rained near Mount Longhu these days. On the side peak of Mount Longhu, raindrops fell in a pitter-patter. A tall and lush green pine tree was like a huge canopy, blocking the wind-dust stone. In front of this huge stone stood a graceful woman. This woman was wearing a red han dress, and her long skirt was flowing. She looked like a fairy in a painting. She stood in the rain, letting the rain fall on her hair, and then slowly converge into water droplets. They flowed over the vermilion beauty mole between her eyebrows, then across her cheeks and finally soaked into her clothes, making her whole body wet. This woman was none other than Ao Wushuang. She didn't know how long she had been standing there, but she was like a stone statue, motionless. She just stared at the huge wind-dust stone. She had been standing like this, trembling slightly under the invasion of the cold rain and humidity. At some point, a low sigh finally came from behind Ao Wushuang. "Are you going to stand like this forever? Why are you hiding from someone who comes to see you?" Hearing this voice, Ao Wushuang's body trembled. She slowly turned around and looked at the man in front of her, who she had been thinking about day and night. "Wang Yuanshan, are you finally willing to come out and see me?" Ao Wushuang's voice was a little hoarse as she whispered. Wang Yuanshan sighed heavily. "If I don't come out, you'll be finished. Don't you know that there is a magic circle here? Not only does it imprison my feet so that I can't leave Mount Longhu for the rest of my life, but it will also slowly weaken the magic power and jinchi of demons like you. Have you felt cold these days? Have you felt that your magic power is draining very quickly?" Ao Wushuang couldn't help but say excitedly, "I don't think so, and I don't care about these things. I only care about why you are so heartless to me. Tell me, why are you like this? If you don't explain it clearly today, I will die in front of you." A hint of pain finally flashed through Wang Yuanshan's eyes. He shook his head sadly and said, "I thought that after 10 years, your feelings would gradually fade, and you would eventually forget me. But I didn't expect." Tears welled up in Ao Wushuang's eyes. She couldn't tell which were tears and which were rain. She cried, "How can I forget you? You stole my heart away 10 years ago. My heart has always been with you. How can I ever forget it? Tell me, tell me." Wang Yuanshan looked extremely pained. He lowered his head and said in a low voice after a long time, "Then I'll give it back to you now, okay?" Ao Wushuang hissed, "It's too late, it's too late." Wang Yuanshan raised his head, his eyes full of tears. He said, "Silly girl. Why are you so silly?" Seeing him like this, Ao Wushuang couldn't help but feel moved. She was surprised and happy but also afraid. She tentatively said, "You still love me, don't you? You said that before, so you must have suffered a lot, right?" The more Ao Wushuang spoke, the more excited she became. She couldn't help but walk quickly to Wang Yuanshan, grab his arm and shake it hard. "Tell me you still love me, don't you?" Wang Yuanshan raised his head, as if he was unwilling to let his tears roll down. He said bitterly, "If I say no, will you believe me?" Ao Wushuang shook her head quickly. "I don't believe it, I don't believe it. You must still love me. I knew it." At this time Ao Wushuang felt as if her heart was about to explode. She was so happy that she hugged Wang Yuanshan and murmured, "I knew you still loved me." Wang Yuanshan raised his hand and wanted to stroke Ao Wushuang's hair, but his hand froze in midair. In the end it fell on her shoulder and slowly pushed her away. Wang Yuanshan said bitterly, "Wushuang, you shouldn't have come. Don't you know that the magic formation under my feet will constantly drain your spiritual power? Ao Wushuang's face was full of tears, but her eyes were full of joy. She shook her head and said firmly, I'm not afraid. As long as I can be with you, I'm not afraid of anything. Wang Yuanshan raised his head in pain. But I'm afraid. Ao Wushuang couldn't help but shout, What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Wang Yuanshan looked at Ao Wushuang deeply and said slowly, The magic formation under your feet is called the Absolute Love Extinguishing Array. At first, your spiritual power will slowly drain, but slowly your cultivation will continue to regress. From 7 tails to 6 tails, from 6 tails to 5 tails, and in the end, you will become an ordinary fox with only 1 tail. At that time, you will no longer have spirituality or demon power. Even all your previous memories will disappear and you will become an ordinary fox. Wang Yuanshan stroked Ao Wushuang's cheek lovingly and said in a trembling voice, Do you want to become like this? His words made Ao Wushuang feel as if a bolt of heavenly thunder had fallen from the top of her head. Her beautiful face turned pale and pale. How could this be? Why was this happening? If she became an ordinary fox and didn't remember Wang Yuanshan, then, what was the difference between her and being dead? But if she couldn't be with Wang Yuanshan, what was the point of living? What should she do? What should she do? Chapter 781. Wang Yuanshan's words made Ao Wushuang feel as if she had fallen into an ice cave. She trembled in fear and said incredulously, Why is this happening? Why did they use such a vicious magic formation to deal with you? Wang Yuanshan gently stroked Ao Wushuang's cheek and said softly, They are not dealing with me. They are dealing with you, Wushuang. 2 lines of clear tears flowed down from Ao Wushuang's eyes. She choked and said, Is it because I'm a fox demon and you're the leader of the Lingong sect? Can't they tolerate us just like that? Wang Yuanshan sighed heavily and said, Wushuang, now do you know why I've been hiding from you? Now do you know why I want to sever the past with you? Forget me and start your own life again. The agreement I made with them was that as long as you were not with me, they would not make things difficult for you. Ao Wushuang suddenly thought of something. She grabbed Wang Yuanshan and said anxiously and earnestly, Yuanshan, you have broken through to the Thunder Retribution realm, haven't you? This magic formation shouldn't be able to stop you, should it? Come with me. We'll hide far away. The world is so big and there must be a place for us to hide. Wang Yuanshan shook his head bitterly and said, Don't be silly. As long as I leave the range of Mount Longhu, I will immediately attract the heavenly thunder. Within a radius of 10 miles, it will be struck by the 9 heaven divine night thunder. Not to mention you, even I will be struck into powder. Ao Wushuang's lips trembled slightly. She looked at Wang Yuanshan in despair and said bitterly, Is there any other way? Wang Yuanshan sighed softly and said, No, don't think about it anymore. Let's get out of here. If you stay any longer, you will degenerate into a 6-tailed spiritual fox. Ao Wushuang hugged Wang Yuanshan tightly and refused to let go. She cried and said, I don't care. Even if I become an ordinary fox again, I will stay by your side. Wang Yuanshan just shook his head and said, Don't be silly. Don't you see that it's starting to rain heavily? It's almost spring and it's time to go through the thunder retribution. At this time, the mystical silver fox will definitely follow her through the thunder retribution. Once she finishes, it will be time for her to wake up completely and recover her strength. At that time, the fierce battle more than 1,000 years ago will be repeated, and the Fox Zen school will definitely become the target of public criticism again. At that time, Ao Wushuang, you'd better run as far as you can. Ao Wushuang was shocked. What? The mystical silver fox? Now the leader of the Fox Zen school is Li Yundong. He has already governed the Fox Zen school very well. Why should the Fox Zen school become the target of public criticism? Ao Wushuang's mind was in a mess. She said in as she as, Li said, Jiu jiaz as she as she as she as she as he as she as. He didn't move at all like a stone statue. After a long time he sighed softly, turned around and walked into the woods. At the foot of the hillside not far away, Zhang Lufang was holding a bamboo umbrella. She turned her head sadly and sighed at her master, Zhang Kongyun, who was beside her. Master, it's so cruel. Why can't they be together? Zhang Kongyun said with a cold face, It's an iron law that humans and demons can't coexist. Although the times have changed, how can humans and demons be together? Zhang Lufang sighed and said, But Ao Wushuang is so pitiful. Zhang Kongyun snorted coldly and said, What is love in the world? This fox spirit is very emotional. It's a pity that she was reincarnated in the wrong body, Zhang Lufang shook her head and said, "Why can't lovers get married?" Zhang Kongyun smiled coldly and didn't say anything. After a while he said, "Don't worry about them. Worry about yourself first. Chaos is coming. With your half-baked skills, humph humph." Zhang Liufang's eyes lit up and she suddenly asked, "By the way, master, how powerful is the mystical silver fox? What if we can't beat her? What is the preparation that Wang Yuanshan mentioned?" Zhang Kongyun looked at the place where Wang Yuanshan's figure had disappeared with a complicated look in his eyes. He sighed heavily and said, "Don't ask. You don't want to know." Zhang Lufang looked at him in confusion. "What? Why do you say that?" Zhang Kongyun's eyes flashed with a touch of irritation and melancholy. He shouted in a low voice, "Don't ask. If you've seen enough, let's go. I really don't know why you're so gossipy all day long. You don't even cultivate properly." Zhang Lufang pouted and muttered in a low voice, "You're so annoying. The cultivation world is about to be finished. What's the point of cultivating?" Zhang Kongyun said angrily, "Bastard, what are you talking about? How could the cultivation world be finished?" Zhang Lufang giggled and said, "Master, tell me, what are you preparing for?" Zhang Kongyun snorted angrily and said, "Stop dreaming. I won't tell you." Zhang Lufang surrounded Zhang Kongyun and said, "Oh master, don't be like this. Tell me quickly. My mouth is sealed. Tell me quickly." Just as the two of them were entangled and going down the mountain, Ao Wushuang was walking on the mountain road in a daze. This time she finally knew Wang Yuanshan's sincerity, but she felt even more pain. God seemed to be deliberately torturing her, making it impossible for her to be with Wang Yuanshan. She walked slowly along the way. She didn't know how long she had walked until she found herself in an unknown wilderness. Her surroundings were filled with mud, and in front of her stood a man with a foreign bloodline. The man stood in the rain with his hands behind his back. The raindrops around him were falling, but they were all bounced off without exception, as if there was an invisible chi shield around him. When Ao Wushuang saw the man at a glance, her originally lifeless eyes finally moved. She moved her gaze stiffly and looked at him. Then she continued to move like a walking corpse, trying to leave him. This man was Wan Jinyuan. When Ao Wushuang was about to pass by him, he suddenly said, "He wants to see you." Ao Wushuang's body froze. Her voice was hoarse as she said in a low voice, "Him? You mean Lu Yi?" Wan Jinyuan was obviously in a good mood. He smiled slightly and his smile was full of complacency. "Yes, he wants to see you." Ao Wushuang moved her eyeballs and looked at him coldly and indifferently. "Why does he want to see me?" Wan Jinyuan curled his lips and said, "Then you should ask him face to face. Maybe you just want to catch up. Maybe he has a way to help you solve your current problem." These words immediately made Ao Wushuang feel as if she had come back to life. She became excited and her eyes widened. "He has a way. Does he really have a way?" Wan Jinyuan chuckled and made a gesture. "You have to verify it yourself." Ao Wushuang gritted her teeth and instantly turned into a beam of blue light, flying toward Dongwu City like lightning. Wan Jinyuan looked in the direction in which her figure had quickly disappeared, shook his head and said with a smile, "What an impatient person." As he said this he also flew over. By the time Ao Wushuang arrived in Dongwu City, it was already night. She went straight to Lu Ye's residence and pushed the door open with a bang. She saw Lu Yi sitting under the eaves quietly watching a game of chess. It was as if he was playing chess and playing with the lights. Ao Wushuang didn't even look at Main Yang, who was next to her. She walked straight to Lu Yi and said, "Do you have a way to save Wang Yuanshan?" Lu Yi didn't look up. He just glanced at Main Yang, who was next to him. Main Yang understood. After kissing him on the forehead, she got up and left gracefully. Lu Yi pointed to an empty stool that had been prepared in front of him and said, "Sit down." Ao Wushuang glanced at it, but she didn't sit down. She was anxious and nervous. She asked with anticipation and fear, "Do you have a way to save Wang Yuanshan? How do you know that I will go to see him?" Lu Yi laughed and shook his head. "I brought you up when you were a child. How can I not know what you are thinking and what you will do? As for saving Wang Yuanshan, I don't have the ability to go to the hinterland of Mount Longhu to save him." Ao Wushuang smiled in despair. Her smile was sad. "I knew it." She turned around and wanted to leave. But at this time Lu Yi suddenly said, "Although I can't do it, someone can." Ao Wushuang turned around like a gust of wind and asked, "Who?" Chapter 782. Lu Yi gently played with the chess piece in his hand and looked at Ao Wushuang with interest. He said, "Do you want to be with Wang Yuanshan so much?" Ao Wushuang's face was very ugly. She bit her lip and said, "Hurry up and tell me." Lu Yi sneered and said, "In order to be with him, you don't care about anything. You don't care about the Shiji and Shimi you get along with day and night, and you don't care about your master. I really want to know how many things you can give up in order to be with him." Wang Yuanshan was Ao Wushuang's weakness. Usually, this cold and beautiful woman had always been indifferent to people, especially to men. Even to Li Yundong, she only secretly praised him in her heart, but her expression had always been indifferent. She was neither enthusiastic nor flattering. She was also strict with Su Chan and kept a straight face. At this time Ao Wushuang was meticulous and calm. She was no less quick-witted than Ziyuan and Zhou Qin. But at this time Ao Wushuang was so worried that she lost her composure. She was no longer as quick-witted as she usually was. She bit her red and soft lips so hard that they almost dripped blood. She said hatefully, "What on earth do you want to tell me?" Lu Yi smiled slightly as if everything in the world was under his control. He said freely, "In fact, you know this person." Ao Wushuang's heart skipped a beat and she said subconsciously, "Li Yundong?" Lu Yi laughed and clapped his hands. "Yes." Ao Wushuang was happy at first, but then she was shocked. She looked at Lu Yi warily and asked, "What do you want to do with him?" Lu Yi shook his head and said with a smile, "Now I just need to wait quietly for the mystical silver fox's power to recover. Why do I need to do anything special? It's just that this magic formation has a special formation eye, which ordinary people can't go to. If a fox spirit like us gets 3 meters away from it, we will immediately be smashed into powder. Moreover, to break this formation eye, a powerful magical weapon like one of the 5 great swords of Taoism is needed. Originally, if the Bahuang sword in your hand was combined with the Liuhe sword, you could break this magic formation. Now this powerful magical weapon is in Li Yunyang's hands, so I said that only he can break it." Ao Wushuang was so excited that she couldn't wait to rush to him and ask for his help. But as soon as she moved, she suddenly thought of something. It was as if a basin of cold water had been poured over her head, and her fiery heart fell into an ice cave in an instant, becoming brighter and brighter. Ao Wushuang's ecstatic expression became cold little by little. She stared at Lu Yi coldly and suddenly said slowly, "You still want to plot against him. If he takes action he will definitely clash with the Jingyi school again, and then you can benefit from it." Lu Yi stared at Ao Wushuang, shook his head and sighed. "Wushuang, why are you still so naive? Yes, Li Yunyang is indeed a rare genius in 100 years, and he has a deep relationship with Su Chan. But you have to figure it out. He is a human being and Su Chan is a demon. If that's all, it's fine. He is also the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King. Do you know what the relationship between the immovable Wisdom King and the mystical Silver Fox is? You don't know, do you?" Lu Yi said with a look of exasperation, "You are the disciple with the best aptitude in our Fox Zen school, and also the disciple I value the most. Why are you so stubborn? Now it's time to take sides and it's urgent. Otherwise, once the mystical Silver Fox recovers her strength, do you think she will let you go if you still waver on both sides?" This sentence suddenly shocked Ao Wushuang. She completely understood the current situation of herself and Su Chan. If they kept wavering and stayed by Li Yunyang's side, the mystical Silver Fox would definitely not let go of the people around the immovable Wisdom King, and the cultivation world would not let go of the fox demons like them. They would become demons that had to be killed quickly. But was she going to hurt Li Yunyang for her own sake? No, it can't be like this. Ao Wushuang's mind was buzzing as if she was fighting with heaven and earth. She shook her head subconsciously as if she couldn't accept such a thing. Lu Yi also knew that Ao Wushuang was cold on the outside but warm on the inside. She valued friendship very much. She could betray her sect for Wang Yuanshan, and she could also return to Mount Tianlong for the safety of her sect regardless of criticism. But in this world the most painful thing was love and righteousness. Lu Yi didn't urge Ao Wushuang. He just looked at her coldly as if quietly waiting for her to make her own choice. He silently watched Ao Wushuang walk out of the yard in a daze as if she had a devil's disease, and her figure disappeared into the night little by little. Wang Jinyan, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said, "Will she go? Why do I feel that this matter is a little unreliable?" Lu Yi smiled slightly. "For Wang Yuanshan she will go." The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Each of them had their own ulterior motives, and they tacitly withdrew their gazes. Ao Wushuang walked in the bustling street of Shantang. She stared blankly at the flourishing street around her. Although it was night, there were still many tourists in the neighborhood. For no reason, she suddenly had a feeling that all the people in the capital are haggard. It was as if everything in the world was bleak and boring. Ao Wushuang knew that Li Yunyang had been extremely kind to the Fox Zen school, and he was even more sincere to Su Chan. She had already concealed her feelings for him before. If she did this kind of thing again, she was afraid that she would make an irreparable mistake. But if she didn't go to Li Yunyang for help, she would never be able to meet Wang Yuanshan again for the rest of her life. This was the most miserable thing in the world. Thinking of this, Ao Wushuang felt as if her heart was being cut by a knife. She was in so much pain that she wanted to die, but she really couldn't do something that went against her conscience. Now she really wanted to kneel down and ask the gods in the dark, "God, what should I do? Who can show me the way?" But of course God would not answer her. God was heartless and treated all living things as dogs. There were so many perverse and evil people in the world, but God did not punish them with a bolt of heavenly thunder. How could he pay attention to Ao Wushuang, a little fox spirit? Ao Wushuang walked on the street in a daze. Along the way there were pairs of figures, and all she could hear were happy songs and laughter. All of this made her more and more depressed. But just as she walked out of Shantang in a daze, she suddenly heard a noise. It turned out that there were several people quarreling in the shop next to the street. Standing at the door was a woman in her 40s. She was wearing a flowery coat and was a little bloated. Her face was full of the marks of time. The woman's small eyes were a little dim. Although her appearance was not very good, others could tell at a glance that she was a yellow-faced woman who was diligent in housework. At the door of her pearl shop, the woman sat down on the cold and hard bluestone ground, crying with snot and tears. She said in the native language of Dongwu, "Why are we all so conscientious?" Outside Bai Ziying was twisting and cursing. She wants to go into the house angrily and pinch the house angrily. If you want to. Ao Wushuang had lived in Dongwu City for many years, so she could understand this extremely difficult to understand Dongwu language. Naturally, she knew that this woman was crying and complaining that her man had found a mistress outside and had even provoked the mistress into the house. She didn't want to live a good life anymore. In front of this woman stood a gorgeously dressed woman. Although it was a cold day, she was wearing a cheongsam. Her figure was graceful and she had heavy makeup on. Her eyes were big and watery and they were captivating. Even a beauty like Ao Wushuang couldn't help but take a second look at her. No wonder men couldn't help themselves when they saw her. This woman did not have the low-key and fear of being a mistress at all. Facing the woman, she retorted sarcastically and also spoke in the native language of Dongwu, "You're a dead woman. Why don't you throw yourself into a mud hut and pinch a pomelo early in the morning? If you throw yourself inside, you will know that you have a mouth and you will die." There were many dialects in China, and the Dongwu language had its own system. It was an extremely difficult local dialect to understand. If outsiders came here and encountered people speaking Dongwu language, it would be as difficult as going abroad. The quarrel between the two women immediately attracted a lot of tourists. These tourists didn't understand, so they asked around. Immediately, someone roughly explained what the mistress had said. She was probably scolding, "You damn woman, if it weren't for you dragging down my Xiao Yun, he would have already succeeded in his career. If it weren't for you, he would be so happy now." When the crowd heard this, they suddenly understood and secretly shook their heads at this arrogant mistress. When the woman heard this, she cried even harder. She grabbed at her man like a madwoman and said, "You want me this morning. Hey, you want me? If you want me, I'll kill you." When the crowd heard this, the woman flew into a rage. She forced her husband to choose her, a wife who had gone through hardships, or a beautiful mistress. She also threatened her husband that if he chose a mistress, she would fight him to the death. They couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. They all looked at the mistress, wanting to see how she would deal with this. The mistress was also a smart person. She grabbed the man beside her, who was in a dilemma and almost wanted to find a hole to hide in. In a soft voice, she said, "Old man, do you want me to lie in the mud and have a good fight?" Her meaning was probably to tell the man not to be afraid of his wife and to live a good life in the future and ignore her. The third party and the first wife quarreling in the middle of the street. This was not something new in modern times, but the third party was so bold and confident and so beautiful, in stark contrast to the first wife who was throwing a tantrum and rolling on the ground. Many of the spectators on the street also leaned towards the third party. The man was caught between his wife and the beautiful mistress. He was in so much pain that he wanted to split himself in half. After struggling for a while, he stamped his feet and fled, leaving only the two women still scolding each other on the street. They were blaming each other, saying, "If it weren't for you, what would have happened to my family?" It seemed that they couldn't wait to destroy each other mentally and physically. The tourists on the street sighed with emotion. Some supported the mistress from a visual point of view, while others supported the woman from a moral point of view. However, in the eyes of Ao Wushuang, she sighed slightly in her heart. When a man and his wife are together, they always make vows of undying love. However, how many women in the world can resist the aging of time, and how many men can resist the temptation of the secular world? When the wife is old and weak, it is when the man is in his prime and successful in his career. At this time, there are often young and beautiful mistresses who take advantage of it. It is easy to find a priceless treasure, but it is difficult to find a lover. Although she and Wang Yuanshan were in so much pain that they wanted to die, she was lucky that she did not meet a heartbreaker. Obviously, Su Chan was also lucky. She met Li Yundong, who was also infatuated with her. This was the most difficult thing in the world. How could she meet such a good man after hundreds or thousands of years of cultivation? She knew how to cherish the relationship between her and Wang Yuanshan. Although she would die 100 times without regret, how could she hurt Li Yundong and Chaner for her own personal feelings? In this way, not to mention whether Wang Yuanshan would forgive her, she would not forgive herself in the future. At this moment, Ao Wushuang suddenly made up her mind and stopped swaying. However, just as Ao Wushuang was about to leave, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. She suddenly thought of the words, "If it weren't for you," that the two of them kept repeating. Ao Wushuang's mind was buzzing, and an extremely bold idea suddenly came to her mind. She thought to herself, if it weren't for the mystical silver fox, then she wouldn't have to make such a painful choice. At this time, the mystical silver fox's strength had not fully recovered. If she wanted to make a move, it was the right time. Chapter 783. As soon as this thought flashed through Ao Wushuang's mind, she was shocked by herself. Who was the mystical silver fox? The cultivators of the younger generation in the modern cultivation world might not know much about this famous devil, but the cultivators of the older generation, especially those in the Fox Zen school like Ao Wushuang, knew it all too well. This was a figure who had single-handedly set off the 10-year war between the north and the south of the Chinese Taoism. This was a hero who had single-handedly caused the collapse of the late Tang dynasty and the division of China into 5 generations and 10 countries. This was a strong man who had provoked the anger and fear of the cultivators of the Chinese Buddhism and Taoism. This was a strong man who could still escape after a group attack. This was a monster who had only escaped to Japan with 1 soul and 2 souls, and could still beat the strongest demon in Japan, Yamata no Orochi. This was the mystical silver fox who had been severely injured but could still fight against the entire Japanese cultivation world and 80,000 elite soldiers with her human body. This kind of unparalleled expert, this kind of legendary figure, he actually wanted to kill her. Even though Ao Wushuang was extremely bold, she couldn't help but be frightened by this thought at this time. She subconsciously looked around as if just thinking about this thought would arouse the killing intent of the mystical silver fox. Ao Wushuang looked around in horror, but there were tourists and bright lights all around. Such a noisy scene calmed Ao Wushuang down slowly, as if hiding in the crowd would bring her great safety. After she calmed down, she thought of Wang Yuanshan and herself, and great courage suddenly surged in her heart. Ao Wushuang knew that if she wanted to attack the mystical silver fox, the best way was to publicize the current whereabouts of the mystical silver fox. Naturally, someone would come to find trouble with her. But there were 2 things wrong with doing this. One was that the mystical silver fox was likely to break through the encirclement and hide again. If she hid this time, she would be completely hidden in the darkness, and no one would be able to find her. When she appeared again, the world would be shocked, and a calamity would come in an instant. As the saying goes, one can only be a thief for 1,000 days. How can one guard against thieves for 1,000 days? If everyone waited for the mystical silver fox to appear all day long, they would not cultivate and would be ready for battle all day long. The second point was that once the news got out, Lu Yi would definitely know that it was related to him. At that time, with Lu Ye's character, he would definitely go all out and immediately find trouble with Su Chan and Li Jiandong. With his strength, it would not be a problem for him to defeat Li Jiandong. Even if Li Jiandong could escape, the people around him would not be able to escape. Now Lu Yi didn't do anything to Li Yundong, because he still hoped that Li Yundong and the Chinese cultivation world would fight to the death. But if he let out the news and pointed his head at the mystical silver fox, Lu Yi would definitely go crazy and fight to the death. Although Li Yundong was strong now, there was still a gap between him and Lu Yi, the 8-tailed earth fox in the Thunder Retribution realm. Especially once the mystical silver fox recovered all its strength would be even more terrible. What Li Jiandong needed now was time. The heavenly thunder was coming. Once he could get through the thunder tribulation, his strength would improve by leaps and bounds again. Therefore Ao Wushuang knew that if she wanted to kill the mystical silver fox, she could only do it secretly. She could not let anyone else know, not even Su Chan. Understanding this, Ao Wushuang slowly moved her feet and walked out of the crowd. She slowly left the bustling street and hid her figure in the thick darkness. Just as Ao Wushuang decided to do something earth-shattering, Li Jiandong and the others did not notice that a terrible turmoil was about to sweep through. Not only them, but also the ordinary people living in the bustling city like them were preparing to celebrate the Spring Festival without noticing it. Now that the Spring Festival was approaching, even the schools that were open later had already started their winter vacation. Many students packed up and returned to their hometowns. Tiannan University had become extremely deserted for a while. Most of the students who rented houses near the school had also checked out. The landlord's business had plummeted and entered the off-season. Early the next morning, the landlord, Mrs. He, got up early and went to her rented house to collect the rent, as if she was afraid that if she was late, the students would run away with her appliances, furniture, and rent. Mrs. He twisted her plump body and climbed up the stairs with difficulty. Step by step, she climbed up the stairs. The family she went to today had left a deep impression on her. Even with her eyes closed, she could feel the door. The reason was very simple. Because there used to be a couple who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth living in this family. Not only had they broken their home appliances and chandeliers, but they had also almost blown up the house. Thinking of that coquettish little fox spirit, Mrs. He was a little angry, especially when she thought of the young man who had humiliated her in front of everyone. She sneered again and again. How could a guy like him open a tea house? How could he shamelessly say that he could do business all over the world? A toad yawning, how arrogant. His arrogance was boundless. As Mrs. He climbed the stairs laboriously, she thought about some unpleasant things. In her life, the happiest time was when she was collecting rent, because she could happily enjoy the various fawning smiles of the tenants, as well as the faces of them pleading for her. The value and meaning of her life was reflected to the greatest extent at this moment. But when Mrs. He finally climbed to the door, she quickly lost her happiness. She found that no matter how hard she knocked, no one answered the door. She opened the door and took a look, only to find that there was no one in the room. Although the clothes and furniture were still there, she had come all the way to collect rent, but the other party was not at home. This really made her unhappy. If she had known earlier, she would have called in advance. Although Mrs. He grumbled in her heart, she knew that even if there was a next time, she still wouldn't call. She liked to launch surprise attacks, and that was the only way she could perfectly appreciate the different reactions on the faces of the tenants, just like when she had suddenly attacked Li Yundong. Mrs. He was about to leave with a sullen look on her face when she suddenly heard footsteps coming down from upstairs. She looked up and saw that it was the tenant's classmate, who was also a student of Tiannan University. Although Tiannan University had already started its winter vacation and many students had already left the campus, there were still some students who lived far away and didn't want to spend money to go back. So they stayed to work part-time and study, and a few of them gathered together to share a room. Mrs. He, the landlady, didn't like such students very much. More people meant more damage to the furniture in her room, and the room would become dirtier. She looked up and saw 3 girls coming down the stairs. Although they weren't very beautiful, they were young and lively. Although they were all wearing sweaters and jeans which made their bodies look a little bloated, they still exuded a vitality that made her jealous. Mrs. He's physique was exquisite and her looks were not ordinary. Coupled with her special identity, the 3 girls who came downstairs recognized her at a glance and greeted her one after another. The landlady smiled hypocritically. "Do you know where your classmates went?" she asked suddenly. One of the girls in the lead glanced at the room she was pointing at and laughed. "They went to work early in the morning." The landlady looked enlightened. "Oh, working? They found a job? Not bad. It's not easy to find a job these days." But in her heart she muttered, "Didn't they just run away? Found a job? Looks like the rent should be higher. But did they find a job so quickly? Did they go to the brothel? Nowadays there are a lot of female college students in the brothel. I don't want my house to become a chicken coop." She quickly smiled and asked, "What kind of job did they find?" But in her heart, she was planning to drive them away as soon as the landlady said something suspicious. But soon the girl smiled and said, "They're waitresses in a tea house." The landlady sneered in her heart. "TSK college students are so worthless now. They can only be waitresses." But she smiled and said, "That's not bad. How's the income? Where's the tea house?" Although Tiannan City was a southern city, it couldn't be compared to places like Guangdong and Fujian, where people like to drink kung fu tea. Tea houses were everywhere in these two places. The local people liked to go to tea houses in the afternoon or at night, drink a bag of kung fu tea and chat with their friends about everything. Some people who were passionate about this kind of thing could drink 5 figures of tea a day. The atmosphere of the tea culture in Tianan City was thin. In such a big city, the number of tea houses could be counted on 2 hands. Although the rarer something was, the more precious it was. If a business was too withering, it would also reflect the cultural phenomenon behind the business. Therefore, in the landlady's impression, tea houses were a bad business. That was why she had dared to make such a big guarantee to Li Yundong. At this time, as soon as she heard that these tenants were waitresses in tea houses, the landlady suddenly looked down on them. But although she was disdainful in her heart, she still smiled. In business, harmony was the most important thing. She still had this little bit of subtlety. The landlady asked with a smile, "Where are they working as waitresses? I'll go and support them someday." The girl didn't know that the landlady was so capable of sweet talk. She said with a smile, "Auntie, come with us now." The landlady didn't expect that her casual words would be taken advantage of by the other party. She thought to herself, "I'm not interested in doing such a waste of money with you." She smiled and waved her hand. "I won't go. You young people go." The girl was enthusiastic and still invited them warmly. "Go ahead, Auntie. We're about to go too." As she said this, she took out a card from her pocket and said with a smile, "We have VIPs. Besides, Xiaoyu said that if we go for a drink, it'll be her treat." The landlady sneered in her heart but said with a smile, "She's just a waitress. It's not easy for her to make money. Don't let her spend money." She didn't finish the second half of her sentence. "Otherwise, if I can't pay the rent, will you help me?" Unexpectedly, the girl covered her mouth and laughed. "Auntie, you're wrong. Xiaoyu's monthly salary as a waitress is not low. At least this much." As she said this, she gestured with her fingers and stretched out 5 fingers. 5,000? The landlady's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. If a monthly salary of 5,000 yuan was in a first-tier city like Beijing or Shanghai, it would be nothing. Even in a second-tier city, it would not be surprising. But in a third-tier city like Tianan City, especially when a waitress in a small tea house could get such a sum, it was really enviable. One had to know that the monthly rent from her landlady was only slightly more than 1,000 yuan for a house with electrical appliances. The girl nodded and said with a smile, "This is just a temporary job. I heard that the former waitress of the tea house is going back to prepare for the spring festival, so she found a beautiful girl in our school to be a waitress. Unfortunately, the president of our student union thinks that we are not beautiful enough to be waitresses. Otherwise, we can also make a small fortune." The girl was straightforward enough. She was frank about her appearance and seemed to be open-minded. But Mrs. He was a little confused when she heard this. She muttered to herself, "What kind of lousy tea house dares to give waitresses a monthly salary of 5,000 yuan? How much money did they have to waste like this? What a pity, what a pity." When the girl saw the landlady lowering her head and thinking, she persuaded her again, "Go, Auntie He. This tea house is very famous. Many people want to drink tea but can't. If it weren't for the fact that Xiaoyu is a classmate of the tea house owner and I am her schoolmate, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to benefit from this." The landlady sneered in her heart. She glanced at the VIP card in the girl's hand and saw that the card was well made. The expensive aura was secondary. The most important thing was that there were 3 elegant words written on it, "Desanxian." When the landlady saw these 3 words, she was stunned for a moment, but then her eyes widened in an instant, as if she had seen a ghost in broad daylight. She stammered, "Desanxian? Is it the Desanxian of the pedestrian street?" The girl nodded quickly and said with a surprised face, "Auntie He, you know it too? Ah, the Desanxian is really famous." The landlady's mouth was wide open, and her chin almost hit the ground. She was tongue-tied as she stammered, "Yes, is it the Desanxian that opened not long ago? Is the boss called Li Yundong?" At this time the other 2 girls also laughed and said, "Auntie He, do you know him too? He is the most famous celebrity in our school. He is so powerful. He started a business before he graduated from college. Now the tea house business is very good." The landlady's face suddenly became very interesting, and her mind was in a mess. She didn't hear a word of the girl's words. The only thing that kept ringing in her ears was, "The business is very good." The landlady's face turned blue and then red. She thought to herself, "No way, this little brat has actually turned over a new leaf? Impossible, how could I have misjudged him? It's impossible for his tea house business to be so popular. Could it be that I really have to stab my own eyes?" As soon as this thought flashed through her mind, the landlady immediately thought to herself, impossible, absolutely impossible. She gritted her teeth and thought to herself, no, seeing is believing. I have to go and have a look. Chapter 784. The landlady made up her mind and quickly smiled. Since you are so enthusiastic, I'll do as you say. I also want to see how good the business of this Desangxian tea house is. She was secretly surprised and doubtful. She still couldn't believe that the business of Desangxian would be that good. In her opinion, maybe these 3 students who had never seen the world were just making a fuss when they saw a few customers drinking tea in a tea house. The landlady didn't believe from the bottom of her heart that the business of Desangxian would be prosperous. In other words, she didn't want to believe that Li Yundong could make a comeback. But she had forgotten an old saying, it is better to be a white-headed old man than to bully a poor young man. Because of their youth, every young person had infinite possibilities. Sometimes, if they were given an opportunity, they could soar to the sky. However, when many adults saw young people who were much younger than them, they often had an inexplicable sense of superiority and condescension. In their eyes, young people were ignorant and reckless. Sooner or later, they would understand the cruelty and coldness of the world and then compromise with the real world, just like what they had experienced. When the landlady faced Li Yundong, she had more or less such a feeling, and the rental relationship between them had nurtured this dark mentality. Especially when the 2 sides had a fierce conflict, the landlady wanted to see the young man fall into the mud forever and be ridiculed by herself forever. Humph. It must be like this. It's just a few little girls who haven't seen the world talking nonsense. The landlady gritted her teeth in her heart. In order to prove this point, the landlady turned around and went downstairs, ready to go with the 3 little girls to see what was going on. In order to keep up appearances and show off, the landlady specially drove her newly bought Dior A6. She had gritted her teeth and spent a lot of money to buy this car. The 4-Circle A6 had a nickname, which was the mistress car, because many rich people and dignitaries were keen on sending this kind of generous and expensive car to please their mistresses. The landlady gritted her teeth and bought this kind of car for no other reason than to prove that women could drive this kind of car without relying on their beauty. Unfortunately, she was too fussy. This kind of showing off her wealth and inexplicable comparison mentality seemed to be no better than that of those mistresses. But a good car was a good car after all. As soon as they drove out, the A6's elegant appearance, elegant black body, and streamlined shape made the 3 little girls exclaim loudly for a while. The landlady found a lot of satisfaction in the envy in their eyes. In theory, the pedestrian street was a place that could not be entered by car, but the rules in China had always varied from person to person. When Li Yundong's Desangxian opened, limousines from inside to outside almost filled the street. Of course, the landlady, who did not like to watch local news, did not know all this. Moreover, she was not a dignitary who could change the rules, so she had to obediently park the car in the underground parking lot, and the 4 of them slowly walked toward the Desangxian. The landlady had always wanted to rent a shop on the pedestrian street and do some business, but the shops here were not cheap, and she lacked connections with the industrial and commercial bureau. Therefore, she could only keep this idea in her mind and could not put it into practice. But what she couldn't do was actually done by Li Yundong. How could she not be envious and jealous? Along the way, the landlady did not know how many times she had guessed the failure of the Desangxian, but when she suddenly came not far from the door of the Desangxian, she was shocked. Before she got close, she saw a group of people blocking the door of the Desangxian. The landlady could not squeeze in, so she had to stand on tiptoe to take a look. The last time she saw the Desangxian, the tea house had not yet opened, and it had not even been renovated. At that time, it was just a deserted shop waiting to be rented. But now, the Desangxian was already a 2-story tea house with a strong classical style. The tea house was yellow in color and it was grand and grand. The corners of the house were flying eaves and arches and it was antique. There was a black plaque with gold characters on the door, and 3 big words were written with immortal chi, Desangxian. Not to mention the business of the tea house, just by looking at its appearance, one could tell that it was of a high grade. The landlady was stunned and then looked down. She saw 2 girls standing at the door in classic black cheongsams with gold threads. These 2 girls were extremely beautiful. Their skin was snow-white and delicate, and their eyes were especially bright and kind. When they saw the guest, they smiled before they said anything. The corners of their eyes were curved into charming arcs, which made people feel good at first sight and couldn't help but want to go in and sit down. The landlady, who hated beautiful women the most, was stunned when she saw them. She couldn't come to her senses. The male tourists passing by on the street almost couldn't walk when they saw them. Many people couldn't afford to drink tea, so they simply took out their mobile phones and cameras to take photos for fun. Therefore, a large group of people crowded at the door of the Desanxian, which was a bit impenetrable. The landlady snorted in her heart and thought, "Are you running a tea house or a brothel?" Of course, she could only think about it in her heart and would not say it out easily. After the landlady glanced out of the crowd, her eyes quickly fell on a tea house of Zhao's tea house opposite the Desanxian. She saw that the tea house was also two-story, but its style was very different. It was full of modern and fashionable style. Through the gap of the curtain covering the upstairs window, she could see that the sofa was made of high-quality fur. Obviously, it had also spent a lot of money to build this tea house. But this tea house was now completely closed for business. Even the plaque was covered with dust, and the corners were densely covered with cobwebs. Compared with the Desanxian, which was as crowded as a market, this tea house was so desolate that it could be described as a sparrow at the door. The landlady was a little surprised in her heart. It seemed that she didn't understand why the Desanxian could force such a fashionable and noble tea house into such a situation. The three girls who came with the landlady obviously didn't expect that the business of the Desanxian would be so good. They looked at each other and soon shouted. They hugged the landlady and squeezed inside at the same time. Women were born to be good at this kind of movement. After they squeezed in with great difficulty, they found that the door of the Desanxian tea house was closed. They could vaguely see that it was full of friends through the gap of the hollowed window. "Why is it closed? You don't want to do business anymore?" The girl in the lead was a little surprised, and her female companion was also a little disappointed. The girl was a little unwilling. She squeezed to the door and asked, but was told by the soft voice of Little Fox, who was acting as a waiter at the door, that she had to get a number first and wait for them before she could go in. This was also the rule that Feng Na and Cheng Cheng had set after learning from the previous experience. A few days ago, the business had suddenly skyrocketed, and there were more customers waiting in the lobby than there were customers drinking tea. Although they still abided by the rules, when one person said a word, the noise of hundreds of people added up was like that of a market. The originally elegant and quiet tea house suddenly fell like a vegetable market, which made people very dissatisfied. After Feng Na learned from the painful experience, she immediately launched a phone reservation service, a booking service, and the waiting service in the outer hall that most restaurants now used. If a restaurant could have such a phenomenon, it meant that the business of this restaurant was simply too good. Therefore, when she heard that they still needed to get a number, the landlady could hardly believe her ears. She was tongue-tied. It was impossible for her to imagine that the business of a tea house could be as good as that of a Western-style restaurant like Pizza Hut, or even better. The landlady quickly came to her senses, and her heart skipped a beat. She knew that her bet with Li Yundong was not going to end well. She subconsciously wanted to turn around and run away, but her feet seemed to be nailed to the ground and she refused to leave. There seemed to be a trace of unwillingness in the depths of her heart. She wanted to see with her own eyes how good the business of this tea house was. What kind of people with mental problems would come here to drink tea? The three girls had come all the way here, so naturally they refused to leave so easily. After getting their number, they sat down on the square stools next to the tea house. The three of them chatted openly and played with their mobile phones under the gaze of the people outside. At this time, the waiter on duty inside also received their text message and came out happily to welcome them. Several female students of Tiannan University were chatting and laughing outside the restaurant. The girl originally wanted to ask her friend to open the back door and lead her in first. Unexpectedly, when the waitress heard this, she shook her head like a rattled drum and whispered, "No, our president is very strict. You don't want me to be fired, do you?" Although Feng Na had retired from the position of president of the student union, she had left a strong mark in the history of the student union of Tiannan University. Therefore, the students in the school were used to calling her president instead of her name. Even now, it was the same when she was in Desanxian. Hearing this, the girl had to give up and stop talking about this matter. Fortunately, they didn't have to wait long before a group of people came out, and they were able to go in. The landlady followed behind them. As soon as she entered the door, her eyes widened. She saw that the tea house was full of people. A rough count showed that there were more than 100 people. However, there was no sound in the tea house. Even if someone spoke, they lowered their voice and chatted in a very low voice. The tea house was strangely quiet. There was only a burst of melodious classical music coming from the tea house, but it was "Fishing Boat Sings at Evening" played by Guzheng. The landlady's expression became a little strange. She couldn't imagine how there was no sound at all when so many people gathered together. She didn't even dare to breathe. The girls were also very curious. In such a quiet environment, it was impossible for them to talk loudly. They all lowered their voices and asked their good friends, the waiters. Although their friends had only been here for 2 or 3 days, they knew a lot of things. After a little explanation, the girls and the landlady suddenly understood that the business of this tea house was brought by the Japanese. At first, most of the people who came were Japanese, and many of them were members of the Yamaguchi-gumi. This group of people was very noisy, but later more Japanese tourists came, and the number of people in China gradually increased, so these gangsters quieted down. In public places, subways, buses and other places, they were very disciplined. Most of their conversations were very low. Even when they were on the phone, they would subconsciously cover their mouths and phones with their hands. They would also turn their bodies to one side, as if they were afraid that a little louder would disturb others. Although Chinese people were the opposite of the Japanese in this regard, especially when they were on the phone, eating and drinking tea, they never lowered their voices, and even spoke a little louder than usual. However, because most of the customers in the tea house were Japanese at the beginning, some of the Chinese guests who had just come to the tea house to drink tea would, without exception, provoke the angry frowns of the Japanese when they talked and laughed loudly in the tea house. Although Feng Na herself was Chinese, she still wanted to make the tea house an elegant and quiet place, not a noisy place like a vegetable market. Therefore, she deliberately created the environment and atmosphere of Desangxian into an elegant place where people who spoke loudly would be uncultured. With someone taking the lead, there would soon be others following suit. Most people were quiet, and a small number of people would also follow suit. Slowly it would become a custom and habit. Even a person like the landlady could not help but be affected by such an atmosphere when she entered the tea house. Her footsteps were much lighter. When they sat down, the landlady opened the menu and took a look. Suddenly, she almost spat a mouthful of blood on the tea table. She saw that the lowest consumption on the menu was a string of auspicious numbers. 888. F*CK, the lowest consumption for a cup of tea is 888 yuan. Why don't you just rob a bank? Do you think this is Shanghai or Beijing? Do you think this tea house is on Earth? The most outrageous thing was that the lowest consumption was only the price of the most ordinary cup of tea. At this moment, the landlady suddenly felt that her behavior of collecting high rent from people was simply the accumulation of virtue for 5 generations. Compared with Li Yundong, she was simply a great philanthropist. Evil, really evil. I've lived for a lifetime, but I've never seen such a F*king shop. The landlady was so angry that her teeth itched. She had such a good house with complete appliances, but she only collected more than 1,000 yuan a month in rent. This broken tea house, for a cup of broken tea, actually dared to rob 888 yuan. The owner of this tea house is a heartless bastard, and the people who drink tea are also brainless idiots. In an instant, the landlady's heart was extremely unbalanced. She cursed in her heart, but unfortunately this time she could not hold back. As she cursed in her heart, she also cursed out loud. The girls sitting opposite her heard this and looked at each other. They wanted to persuade her, but they did not know what to say. After all, you're here to drink free tea. You can't drink tea and curse, right? But the girls were too embarrassed to speak, and the Japanese beside them heard the landlady's curses. They turned their heads one after another. What was even more unfortunate was that this group of Japanese were all Yamaguchi people, and there was an interpreter sitting among them. Under the unfriendly gazes, the interpreter's forehead was full of sweat as he translated the landlady's words. When the group of Japanese heard this, they immediately became furious. What? How dare you scold the reincarnated Wisdom King's tea house? How dare you scold us for being brainless? The Yamaguchi people were unhappy. They immediately took off their clothes, revealing their sturdy tattoos. They scolded loudly, F*King dear. Then they walked toward the landlady aggressively. Chapter 785. The landlady was obviously shocked by the Yamaguchi gangsters. She could not understand why they would be so agitated by her scolding Li Yundong. Especially when the landlady saw the tattoos on the bodies of the Yamaguchi gangsters, she was so scared that her heart was in turmoil. There were many gangs in Tianan City, especially in the summer. People with tattoos could often be seen wandering on the streets, especially at night when the food stalls were full of these guys. But the tattoos on these guys were very simple. Not to mention the dark colors, most of them only had a few tattoos, and the most tattoos were a dragon with teeth and claws on their backs. It was not a big deal to say that it was a dragon. It might look good when it was first tattooed, but after a few days, it really looked like a loach tattooed on the body. But among the Yamaguchi gangsters in front of her, The one with the least tattoos was a young man on the far left. He had a head of black hair that was split 3 to 7, and a 9-tattooed dragon was tattooed on his chest and back. The dragon's head was on his chest, the dragon's eyes were the 2 points on his chest, the dragon's mouth was the abdomen, the dragon's arms were the 2 dragon's claws, and the dragon's scales on his back were bright green and dazzling red. But between the scales there was a black contrast, which set off the layered and 3-dimensional feeling, giving people a strong visual effect. In the eyes of the landlady, compared to the 9-tattooed dragon in Tianan City, the gangsters in front of her were extremely unprofessional. Just from the point of tattoos, it was like a kindergarten student meeting an expert at the doctoral level. The two were not on the same level at all. Why did most gangsters like tattoos? Especially the better the tattoos, the more awesome they were, and the more awesome they were? The reason was simple: tattoos hurt very, very much. Although there were laser tattoos and anesthetics, very few people in the underworld would use laser tattoos and anesthetics. Was it a joke? If the gangsters found out that they got a tattoo and anesthetics, they would laugh themselves to death. How could they still make a living? However, if one had tattoos all over their chest and back like this man, even a layman like the landlady would know that it would definitely be a very painful thing. It would be so painful that it would make one hover between life and death. Not to mention an ordinary person, even a second-rate person wouldn't dare to do it. If they were so cruel to themselves, what about others? To be able to endure the pain brought about by such a large area of tattoos, he was definitely a monster among monsters. During a PK, just by flashing this tattoo, as long as the opponent knew what was good for them, they would have to think twice. Could they afford to provoke such a ruthless character? However, this 9-tattooed dragon had the fewest tattoos. After all, a dragon was a dragon, a snake-like animal. It was impossible for it to have tattoos all over its chest and back. Their leader had a tattoo of Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva on his chest. This Bodhisattva was one of the 6 Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva, who held the Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva to help the Azura path. He wore a red kasaya with yellow monk robes inside. He held the Vajra pagoda in his left hand and performed the fearless seal with his right. This Bodhisattva had a colorful crown on his head. His face was like powder and there was a flame halo above his head. Behind him was a vast sky surrounded by colorful clouds. There were 7 lotus platforms under his feet, and each lotus platform had a different colored flame. There were so many things tattooed on the front of the body. At first glance, people would think that it was a moving painting of a human body running around. But that was not all. There was a jade-faced Yama tattooed on the back of the boss. This Yama was extremely handsome, but he was stepping on a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. In one hand he held a ferocious-looking head, and in the other hand he held a sword dripping with blood. This handsome face formed a sharp contrast with the horrifying scene. In particular, the colors were mostly red and green, giving people an extremely strong visual impact. When others took a closer look, they found that, except for the area below his neck, there was not an inch of his skin that was the color of flesh. Even Mike in Prison Break, who had tattoos all over his body, would feel ashamed of his inferiority when compared to him. Even a blind man could tell that this person was definitely a gangster. The landlady was so scared that she trembled all over. Even the girls around her were so scared that they wanted to run away. But as soon as they stood up, they saw another group of people standing around them. Each of them was wearing black suits, black trousers, black leather shoes and black sunglasses. The only thing missing was a few big words on their faces: "I am a gangster." As soon as these people stood up, the girls were so scared that they fell back on their butts. Tears welled up in their eyes. They wanted to shout, "I'm just here to watch the soy sauce. I didn't say those words just now. Don't come at us." The landlady looked at these tattooed people standing in front of her and shouting at her. She felt aggrieved and confused. Although she was afraid, she still struggled to argue loudly, but her voice was slightly trembling. She said, "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the owner, Li Yundong. What are you doing?" After the tattooed man heard the translation, he became even angrier. He slapped the table with a bang, and his eyes almost stared at the landlady's face. He cursed her with filthy words, but fortunately the landlady couldn't understand him. She was just scared and trembled. The translator who followed them was obviously a good civilian. As he wiped his sweat, he carefully said in stiff Mandarin, "He said that the Li Yundong you scolded is the Buddha they believe in." As he said this, he pointed to a statue in a shrine in the Desangxian Hall and said, "That's the one. It's the immovable wisdom king." When the landlady heard this, she thought, "What? This little kid who almost blew up my house is actually the Buddha they believe in? Are you kidding me?" Do you think I'm an idiot? Although the landlady was afraid, she couldn't help laughing when she heard the translation's words. Her laughter was terrible and she was in big trouble. Although there were fewer and fewer people in the Yamaguchi group these days, there were still more than 20 people in the tea house at this time. These were all members who had come from Kanto. The Yamaguchi-gumi's power in Kanto was not obvious. It had been suppressed by the other two major gangs in Japan, the Sumiyoshi Association and the Inada Association. The two sides were fighting fiercely, and it was the place with the most intense gang conflicts in Japan. But even so, these devout believers still rushed to Tianan City to worship the gang boss of the Buddhist world in their hearts, the immovable Wisdom King. When these gangsters set off, they had obviously been warned. They knew that they had to keep a low profile in China. Otherwise it would be a diplomatic incident which would be very troublesome. If they caught people, they might not be able to get them back. Therefore these Yamaguchi people were very low-key here. They would not cause trouble if they could, and they would swallow their anger if they could. Even when they squeezed into the Desanxian Hall and were stepped on a few times, they did not make a sound. But there were exceptions to everything. Most people in China were not religious, so they could not understand how terrible the anger in their hearts would be when the God they believed in was insulted. This was like a good-tempered Muslim coming to the ground of a foreign country and preparing to live a peaceful and low-key life. He did not expect to be pointed at his nose and scolded Allah the next day. This Muslim would definitely go back without saying a word and fight desperately. This was the power of faith. Although not all of these Yamaguchi people were devout Buddhists, these Yamaguchi people who had traveled thousands of miles from Kanto to Tianan City to worship the immovable Wisdom King were definitely devout believers. If they pointed at their noses and scolded them, they would not necessarily turn hostile. But if they scolded the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King, they would definitely not be polite. The leader's face suddenly flashed with a murderous look, and his eyes were full of murderous intent. The other Yamaguchi people also had fierce looks in their eyes, and they quickly searched around. They had flown over from the distant Kanto, so they were naturally unarmed. At this time, seeing that there was going to be a conflict and they were all experienced fighters, they immediately turned their eyes to all the weapons they could use in the tea house. Tea tables, benches, teapots, broken pieces of teacups that were like sharp blades, and so on. The landlady rocked back and forth in laughter. She did not realize that there was something wrong with her. She only heard the Japanese let out a thunderous roar and cursed. Then, with a grab of his hands, he lifted her body, which weighed more than 200 kilograms, over his head. He rushed a few steps forward and threw her out with a bang. The landlady had never suffered like this before. Her whole body was like a sandbag, and she immediately hit the door of the tea house and fell heavily to the ground. The tourists outside the door were startled, but the two little foxes at the door reacted quickly. The little fox that was close to the landlady leaped up and wrapped its arms around the landlady, who weighed a few hundred kilograms, in one fell swoop and pulled her into its arms. If the landlady hit the ground with the force of the throw, she would be half dead or at least half dead. If that happened, it would immediately cause a vicious diplomatic incident. Soon, Feng Na and Ching Ching, who had heard the news in the tea house, were also shocked. They did not expect that the two of them would go into the tea house and talk for a while, and then such a thing would happen outside. Feng Na's expression changed and she shouted at the Yamaguchi people, "What happened? Put on your clothes." The leader of Yamaguchi-gumi regretted throwing the landlady out. He immediately lowered his head and let out a sigh. He quickly put on his clothes and led his team members to kneel in front of Feng Na. He prostrated himself and lowered his head. His face was full of remorse and shame as he muttered some gibberish. Feng Na listened to the translation and roughly understood that the Japanese was apologizing to her and saying that he would bear all the consequences and losses. She wasn't very clear about the strange relationship between Li Yundong and the Yamaguchi-gumi, so she had always disliked the Yamaguchi-gumi. But after all, they had come to drink tea politely, so she couldn't drive them out. But welcoming guests was one thing. It was obviously impossible for her to have a good impression of these guys who walked the underworld. Now that such a thing had happened, Feng Na was a little annoyed. However, she still calmly inquired about the cause and effect of the matter. After asking about what had happened, the leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi saw that the beautiful lady boss of the tea house did not look too good. He clenched his teeth and pressed his palm against the ground. Then he casually broke a teacup, picked up the sharpest porcelain blade, and placed it on his little finger. He then spoke loudly. Even without the translation, the people around them understood that this guy wanted to cut off his finger as an apology. Feng Na had never encountered such a thing before. She was so scared that her face turned pale. She subconsciously wanted to wave her hands, but at that moment, the landlady outside had been saved by the little fox at the most critical moment. But she quickly came back to her senses and sat on the ground shouting, "The Japanese are hitting people. The Japanese are going to kill people." The power of this sentence was infinite in the land of China. When the people outside who did not know the truth heard it, they immediately made a ruckus. As soon as Feng Na heard this, her mind immediately exploded with a buzz. Her lips trembled and she said, "Oh no, something big has happened." She turned her head abruptly and quickly said to Cheng Cheng, who also looked frightened, "Quick, call Li Yundong. Something has happened." Chapter 786. Cheng Cheng also realized the seriousness of the problem. She immediately dialed Li Yundong's number. Fortunately, ever since Su Chan and Zi Yuan had been in danger in Harrisburg, Li Yundong had chosen to carry his mobile phone with him these days. Although it was still in silent mode, it was still vibrating. Li Yundong quickly answered the phone. After saying this to Li Yundong, Cheng Cheng hung up the phone and nodded to Feng Na, indicating that Li Yundong would come in a moment. Only then did Feng Na feel relieved. Her heart, which had been hanging in her chest, finally calmed down. At present, de Sanxian was thriving. If the business was ruined because of such a problem, even if Li Yundong didn't blame her, Feng Na wouldn't forgive herself, and she wouldn't have the face to stay any longer. The round-faced beauty saw that the onlookers outside who didn't know the truth were making a ruckus. Her heart tightened and she secretly gritted her teeth. The problem between China and Japan was the most fragile nerve of this nation. Even the smallest thing could quickly lead to a terrible disaster. Feng Na tilted her head and looked at the waiter who served the landlady. She asked with an ugly expression, "Did you serve her?" The implication of this sentence was that she wanted to hold the waiter accountable. This was the suffering of working in the catering industry and the service industry. Sometimes, although the problem was with the guests, when there was a problem, it was the waiter and the lobby manager who came out to apologize together. Wasn't the rich the master? Feng Na originally wanted the waiter to go out with her to apologize, but she didn't expect that the waiter would be so scared that her pretty face turned pale. She thought that Feng Na was going to fire her. She valued this job very much. Where could she find such a lucrative job now? Besides, this was Tianan City. How many jobs in a third-tier city could offer a temporary worker like her, who had not yet graduated from a third-tier university, a job with a monthly salary of more than 5,000 yuan? Unless it was a charity. When the girls who had come before saw that their friends were so scared that tears were welling up in their eyes, they all secretly regretted it. Especially the girl who had taken the initiative to invite the landlady over for tea. She was even more resentful in her heart. "You old woman, it's okay that you don't appreciate the free tea I invited you, but how dare you make such a scene? Aren't you trying to make trouble?" The girl was very loyal. She took the initiative to take all the blame and said, "It's all my fault. I invited her here. She's our landlord. I just wanted to." Before she could finish, Feng Na stretched out her hand and stopped her. Feng Na gently shook her head and said, "Now is not the time to find out who is right and who is wrong. What matters now is how to solve this problem." The leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi had been listening to the translator softly translate the conversation between Feng Na and the others. At this moment, when he heard what she said, he immediately gritted his teeth, yelled, and used a piece of porcelain to cut off his pinky finger. The moment he exerted force, blood immediately gushed out of his finger. The guests and Feng Na were all scared out of their wits. How sharp was the porcelain shard? How painful would it be to use it to cut one's pinky finger? Feng Na felt a headache coming on. She quickly advised, "Stop, stop." However, the leader was also stubborn. He raised his other hand high and was about to slap the porcelain shard, trying to break his finger. Just as his hand was about to fall, he suddenly slapped someone's arm. He was stunned for a moment, thinking that it was one of his subordinates who had stopped him. Anger rose in his heart, and he was just about to turn his head to reprimand them when he saw a handsome young man gently holding his arm. Feng Na and the others were focused on the leader. They didn't notice that there was suddenly an extra person next to them. She shifted her gaze and fixed her eyes on him. Suddenly she was overjoyed. "Li Yundong? You're here." "Li Yundong?" The leader didn't understand Chinese, but he could still understand these 3 words. He was shocked and quickly looked at Li Yundong carefully. What a joke, this was the reincarnation of Wisdom King. So many members of Yamaguchi-gumi had come to de Sanxian before, but none of them had met the true God. Today he had met one. It was a great joy and a great blessing. Originally, this small leader was quite resentful about the matter of his finger being cut off. He had come to China for no reason, but he had lost his finger for no reason. Anyone in his shoes would be unhappy, but now he was ecstatic. He felt that it was too worthwhile to lose his finger. The leader immediately prostrated himself on the ground and began to talk. The members behind him also prostrated themselves on the ground, not daring to raise their heads. It was as if they had really seen the leader of Yamaguchi-gumi. The guests in the tea house had changed from tea guests to onlookers. They all stretched their necks to look at Li Yundong. Some of them more or less knew that the identity of the owner of this tea house was very mysterious and strange. Many Japanese had come here from thousands of miles away just to sacrifice this living person. Such a thing was very rare in remote cities or rural areas of China, let alone in such a modern city. Everyone only felt that it was a new experience. Looking at Li Yundong, who was too young, they sighed and pointed at him in a low voice. Li Yundong had been outside to prepare the New Year's goods with Su Chan and Zi Yuan. He hadn't expected to encounter such a disgusting thing at this time. He was secretly unhappy, but his face was quite calm. After stopping the leader's self-mutilation, he turned his head to look at Feng Na and said, "What on earth is going on? Tell me first." Feng Na was quite eloquent. In just 2 or 3 words she had clearly explained what had happened. After listening, Li Yundong looked outside and immediately laughed out of anger. Well, if this landlady hadn't come out herself, I would have almost forgotten about her. Well, instead of hiding far away, you came here to behave atrociously. You can't even let me have a good New Year's Day. You're really something. Li Yundong sneered in his heart. He nodded to Feng Na and the girl who had come with the landlady, but his face was quite kind as he said, "It's okay. Just come out and make things clear. I don't believe that no one can reason with me." Li Yundong took the lead and walked out. The crowd outside, who didn't know the truth, heard the landlady's encouragement. At this time they all shouted loudly as if they wanted to tear down de Sanxian. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He thought to himself, "Brothers and sisters, don't vent your anger. I was still hoping to make a fortune by killing the Japanese. Now that they have been driven away by you, who can I kill?" Yes, there were indeed a lot of people who forgot their ancestors and clung to the Japanese to suck their hemorrhoids. But that was because they were begging the Japanese to invest. Who did I offend? It was the Japanese who cried and begged to give me money. I can't just push the money away, right? Patriotism is not love like this. Thinking of this, Li Yundong's eyes fell on the landlady with extreme hostility. The grudge between the two of them was not very big, but it had been going on for a long time. Everyone in the world had times when they were down and out, and people had the best memory when they were down and out. Whoever had offended them and helped them, it was really unforgettable. Seeing the landlady, Li Yundong remembered the situation when he and Su Chan had been driven out by this guy. He was angry, especially when he thought of the bet he had made with her before. Although he didn't expect this old woman to really stab her own eyes, she couldn't ruin his show like this. Even a clay figurine had a temper. Anger was hidden in Li Yundong's eyes, and his face was gloomy. He stood in front of the crowd without being angry. Although he had not cultivated for a long time, the number of times he had fought with people was more than many cultivators who had cultivated for a lifetime combined. After these life-and-death battles, he had long possessed an extraordinary momentum. Usually he restrained his chi so ordinary people couldn't feel it. At this time, when he released his chi, it was really an invisible pressure that instantly enveloped the whole place. It was as if Buddha had turned his wrist and pressed down a 5 elements mountain, a group of naughty Sun Wukong monkeys under the mountain. At this moment the air became frozen, and the noisy crowd instantly quieted down. The crowd only felt that this overly young boy had an indescribable majesty, which made them not dare to act rashly. The landlady was still making a scene with tears and snot running down her face. When she suddenly heard the silence around her, she subconsciously looked up and immediately recognized the little brat she had looked down upon. He was standing in front of her, looking down at her coldly. Li Yundong's gaze made the landlady feel cold all over, and she unconsciously shivered. She had never seen such a pair of majestic eyes. Logically speaking, such a pair of eyes should only appear on a middle-aged person of high status. This person held great power and controlled the life and death of many people. Slowly he would be able to cultivate such a dignified aura. But how could it appear on a young boy in his 20s? This was impossible. The landlady felt as if her heart was being squeezed by a pair of invisible hands. Not to mention thinking she couldn't even breathe properly. She swallowed the words she had wanted to say. No matter what, she couldn't say them. Li Yundong glanced at her and glanced at her. Then, he turned his head and nodded to the girl behind him, indicating for her to tell him what had happened. The girl was also bold. She explained the general situation of the matter in front of everyone, and only then did everyone understand. Although the people hated Li Yundong, they were not unreasonable people. As soon as the matter was explained clearly, everyone naturally calmed down, especially the leader of the Yamaguchi Gumi. He walked quickly to the front of the crowd, knelt down in front of them and apologized to them. The crowd looked at each other, speechless. As soon as the landlady saw Li Yundong appear, she immediately deterred the crowd with her incomparably powerful aura and made them not dare to make any noise. At this time she even made the final conclusion and quickly settled the matter. She wanted to pester him endlessly, but she knew that she was in the wrong. She felt guilty and didn't dare to say anything no matter what. She sat on the ground, looked at the crowd foolishly, and then looked at Li Yundong foolishly. She wanted to sneak away in the chaos. But Li Yundong had been watching her. How could he let her go so easily? He immediately pressed the landlady's shoulder and said with a smile, "Auntie He, long time no see. How have you been recently?" The more affectionate his smile was, the more the landlady trembled in her heart. Even such a gangster could respect the boy in front of her like a god. One bad word and he threw her out. She had treated him like that before. How could Li Yundong take revenge on her? The landlady put herself in his shoes and was so scared that she almost peed and defecated. Her legs went soft and she was about to kneel on the ground, begging for mercy. But Li Yundong reacted quickly. He held her shoulder and said with a smile, "Auntie He, it seems that you have been in poor health recently. Come to our tea shop and have some tea. I guarantee that you will be healthy and at ease." As he said this, he raised his head and shouted at the waiter in the shop, "Come on, treat my Auntie He well." The landlady wanted to cry but had no tears. She wanted to turn around and run, but her arm was grabbed by Li Yundong. An inexplicable force pulled her, making her unable to move, let alone shout. She could only watch herself walk step by step toward the Desanxian, as if she was going to step into a devil's den and go deep into hell. She turned her head and watched the door of the tea shop behind her close with a bang. The landlady wailed in her heart, "I'm going to die." Chapter 787. The landlady entered the tea house in fear. She saw that the customers in the tea house were all looking at her strangely, like a group of onlookers waiting to be beheaded at the entrance of a vegetable market in Beijing. In particular, there was a group of unkind and covetous Yamaguchi people next to her. No matter how she looked at them, their gazes made her hair stand on end. The landlady wanted to say a few words of mercy, but Li Yundong's jinchi had invaded her body and tightly locked her lungs, making it difficult for her to breathe, let alone speak. Li Yundong smiled at the people in the tea house and said, "It's a misunderstanding. It's okay. Everyone please continue." Only then did everyone withdraw their gazes, but there were still many people who kept glancing at them out of the corner of their eyes. As the owner of the tea house, Li Yundong naturally sat down at the tea table, pointed to the seats, and smiled at the girls who were at a loss and didn't know what to do. "Sit down, what are you waiting for?" Li Yundong was a junior this year and these girls were also his classmates, but they were in the same school but in different departments. Before Li Yundong became famous, they naturally didn't know who this fat otaku was. But after Li Yundong became famous, because his status and reputation had climbed too high and too fast, it was impossible for them to say a few words to him. They could only occasionally meet him at school and look at him from a distance. But now they suddenly saw the most legendary figure of Tiannan University appear in front of them. Although they didn't understand how Li Yundong had appeared, who cared? Most importantly, the elusive legendary emperor was sitting right in front of them and talking to them with a smile. The girls were so excited that their cheeks were red and their eyes were shining. They knew that if they told their sisters what had happened today, they would be envied. Hearing Li Yundong's greeting, the girls all took their seats and looked at Li Yundong excitedly. It seemed that they had countless gossip questions to ask him. Li Yundong seemed to have expected this. He turned his head to look at the landlady ahead of time, not giving them a chance to gossip at all. Li Yundong's face was full of enthusiasm. He smiled at the landlady and said, "Auntie He, why didn't you tell me in advance that you were coming today? I could have made some preparations." As he said this, he smiled at Feng Na, who was a little dumbfounded. "Why are you still standing there? Why don't you bring the menu?" As if awakened from a dream, Feng Na turned around to get the menu, but Li Yundong quickly said, "Forget it. Just make a few cups of the best Huangshan Maofeng." The landlady and these girls didn't know much about tea, so they didn't know what the top-grade Huangshan Maofeng tea was. They saw a very beautiful girl who looked a little like a fox step forward and skillfully make tea. The whole process was pleasing to the eye and dazzling. The girls looked at her and sighed, but the landlady was not in the mood to appreciate it. The more she looked at Li Yundong's smile, the more she felt that he was up to no good. Although he was smiling brightly at the moment, he might have some bad ideas in his mind. Humph, a weasel paying a visit to a chicken for the new year. The landlady looked at Li Yundong nervously, and her eyes kept staring at the hands of the tea waitress, for fear that she would do something bad later. The little foxes were also foxes from the Fox Zen school. Although they didn't know much about the world like Su Chan, they had been familiar with their shirshu since they were young. They were good at zither, chess, calligraphy, painting, making tea and tasting wine. Although their tea skills were not as good as Ziyuan's, they were more than enough to deal with the situation. After Little Fox made the first cup of tea, she was about to pour it away, but Li Yundong held her hand and said with a smile, "Come on, give Auntie He a cup." Little Fox looked at Li Yundong in confusion and blinked. She didn't seem to understand why Li Yundong would give the first cup of water used to wash the tea to someone else. In the art of tea, the tea brewed for the first time was not to be drunk. It was only used to wash the tea leaves, and the tea brewed afterward was to be drunk. Although there were many customers here, not many people knew this rule. Most people just watched the tea waitress perform, and few people cared about why the first cup of tea couldn't be drunk. Li Yundong was obviously taking advantage of the landlady's ignorance of the art of tea. He smiled and persuaded her to drink the tea. Although Little Fox didn't know what Li Yundong was up to, she still obediently held the teacup with both hands and brought it to the landlady. Although the landlady didn't know the rule that the first cup of tea couldn't be drunk, how could she dare to drink it? What a joke. There's no poison in the tea. The landlady's face was full of suspicion. She wanted nothing more than to stick a silver needle out of her eyeballs and test the poison in the tea. Li Yundong sneered inwardly at the sight of the landlady, but he still put on a warm smile on his face. He smiled and picked up a cup of tea. "Auntie He, this is a tea house," he said. "I'll replace wine with tea. Here's to you." As he spoke, he tilted his head back and drank the steaming hot tea like he was drinking wine. The landlady noticed that the tea Li Yundong brought out was the same as the tea in front of her, coming from the same teapot. At that moment, the landlady even thought that there was a mechanism in the teapot. Usually it would be non-toxic tea, but when the mechanism was turned, it would be poisonous tea. Obviously, the landlady's imagination had reached a certain level at this moment, reaching the level of a domestic TV series. Her tiny eyes kept sweeping back and forth over the teacup, but she refused to take it. Li Yundong smiled meaningfully and said, "Auntie He, why won't you drink it?" His words made the landlady shiver. She subconsciously looked around, only to see that the people at the mountain pass were staring at her with unkind eyes, as if they would teach her a lesson if she didn't drink it. She thought to herself, "I guess Li Yundong won't be so bold as to give me poisonous tea in front of everyone, right?" After thinking about it, the landlady gritted her teeth, grabbed the teacup, raised her head, and drank it in one gulp. The wind was howling, the water was cold, and the strong man who drank the tea would never return. Seeing that she had drunk the tea, the girls next to her also dared to reach out and drink, but Li Yundong stopped them with a smile. "Don't. This first cup of tea is specially for Auntie He. If you want to drink it, drink the second cup." The leading girl was also very clever and obedient. She withdrew her hand and said with a smile, "So we followed the landlady today." Li Yundong couldn't help laughing when he heard this. Although the people next to him didn't know what he was laughing about, Li Yundong's aura was too strong. As soon as he laughed, the people around him also laughed. The landlady also felt that it seemed a little inappropriate for her not to laugh. After her cheeks twitched twice, she forced a fake smile. Li Yundong laughed for a while and nodded to Little Fox, asking her to continue making tea. He kept persuading the landlady to drink the tea. The landlady was also very straightforward. She knew that it was impossible for her to walk out of the Desanxian unscathed today. The landlady made up her mind and thought to herself, "Anyway, this tea is ridiculously expensive, so I might as well drink it back." She also let go of her appetite. She drank every cup that Li Yundong gave her. She was not a refined person, so how could she taste the quality of the tea? When the tea guests next to her saw her drink cup after cup like pouring wine, they all secretly bared their teeth and shook their heads. They secretly thought that this woman was chewing on peonies, wasting the lute and boiling the crane, and it was a great spoiler. However, Li Yundong didn't seem to be aware of it. He just accompanied her with a smile. It was not until the last pot of tea had been brewed 7 times that he stopped persuading her. He smiled and took the landlady's arm, pulling her out, and said with a smile, "Auntie, it was a pleasure drinking tea with you today. You must come again when you have time in the future." The landlady was a little confused as she was pulled out by him. When they were out of the door, she was stunned and blurted out, "You just let me go?" Li Yundong also pretended to be surprised and looked at her. "Do you still want to stay here for dinner?" The landlady was choked by him and didn't know how to reply. She looked at Li Yundong strangely. She only felt that although the boy's appearance and figure didn't seem to have changed much from before, the overall feeling of his whole person had changed dramatically. She only felt that Li Yundong was unfathomable. He had kneaded her like a dough, molding her into any shape he wanted. Her emotions and speech were completely controlled by him. At this time, there were still some busybodies who had stayed in front of the tea house and refused to leave. When they saw Li Yundong and the landlady walking out happily together, they all felt relieved and left one after another. It didn't seem that they had any grudges against each other. After the landlady boldly took a few steps out, she looked back nervously, only to see that Li Yundong was still waving at her and smiling. She also forced a smile and subconsciously waved her hand, then turned her head and walked away quickly. She walked faster and faster. When she was out of Li Yundong's sight, she was walking as fast as she could. When she drove all the way back to her home and locked the door, she calmed down. She couldn't believe that Li Yundong had let her go so easily. Could it be that I wronged him? The landlady's expression was a little strange, but not long after this thought flashed through her mind, her stomach suddenly turned upside down. Her face changed and she rushed to the toilet as if her butt was on fire. As soon as she untied her pants, she made a noise like firecrackers. What she didn't know was that the top-grade Huangshan Maofeng tea that Li Yundong had given her was Zi Yuan's precious collection. Because this top-grade immortal tea had been stored for too long, it needed to use the tea that had been brewed for the first time to remove the yin qi in it. When it was brewed for the second time, there would be no yin qi or turbid qi, only immortal qi and clear qi. However, Li Yundong had bad intentions. He made her drink the first cup of tea, and then he made her drink the rest of the tea from beginning to end. The clear qi and turbid qi in her stomach mixed together and attacked each other. Naturally, it would turn the river and the sea upside down. The landlady finally came out of the toilet, but before she could sit down, her stomach rumbled again. She had no choice but to rush back in, complaining incessantly and wailing. In the Desangxian tea house, after the tea house's business was over, the little fox who had been puzzled, returned home and told Su Chan and Zi Yuan about the matter. After thinking about it, Zi Yuan and Su Chan quickly figured out the crux of the matter. Zi Yuan smiled and explained the key to it. Su Chan smiled and put her arm around Li Yundong's and said, Well, let's teach this blind guy a lesson. Let her bully us." Li Yundong put on a straight face and pretended to be angry. "Nonsense, how could I teach her a lesson? I invited her to tea. This is repaying evil with good. I'm a gentleman." His words made the people next to him laugh. Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "You're too wicked. Not only did you mess with her, you even took advantage of her." Li Yundong didn't comment. He put his hands behind his back, raised his head, and suddenly recited a poem by Li Bai. "Don't you see, the water of the yellow river comes from the sky and rushes to the sea, never to return?" When everyone heard his pretentious recitation, they all remembered that the landlady was going to live in the latrine for a long time in the next few days. The water of the yellow river came from the sky and rushed to the sea, never to return. They couldn't help laughing gloatingly. Chapter 788. Li Yundong had played a trick on the landlady, which made Su Chan vent her anger. However, the little girl still felt that it was a little too easy for this damned woman who had driven them out. If it had been her, she would have been polite if she hadn't hit the landlady in the face with a brick. The landlady cursed Li Yundong while squatting in the toilet for 2 whole days. Finally, she got rid of the stinky toilet. After 2 days, she had lost a lot of weight. It could be considered that she had lost weight. Although she knew that Li Yundong was most likely playing tricks on her, the landlady did not dare to say anything. What a joke. If she caused any more trouble, who knew if the tea she drank next time would really be poisoned? But this was just a small episode. Life was like this. Sometimes it was earth-shattering, and both sides wished they could destroy each other spiritually. But when the matter was over and looking back, they often had a feeling of shaking their heads and laughing, just like a person who had matured and grown up looking at himself when he was still young. Li Yundong was like this. He had learned about the landlady and completely announced that he had said goodbye to his previous youth. He who had cultivated to the Jinshan phase in his 20s, would usher in his glorious years. However, before that, what Li Yundong wanted most was to have a good new year with the people around him. This was the first spring festival he had spent since he had met Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin. Although there was still some time before the spring festival, it was now approaching the 23rd of the 12th lunar month, which was also the day of the Little New Year. Although the cultivation world had declined to the point that it was almost hidden from the world, and contemporary society had paid less and less attention to tradition, the cultivation world still maintained its traditional position under the impact of the torrent of reform and opening up. Zi Yuan was a genuine inner disciple. 5 generations of her ancestors were all cultivators. She was a fairy who had started cultivating in her mother's womb. Whether it was in her mind or in her bones, she was deeply imprinted with the elegance and dignity of traditional Chinese women, meek and gentle, as well as the characteristics of conservative and introverted. The importance that Zi Yuan attached to tradition was deep in her bones. She knew that she might be imprisoned, but in order to abide by the tradition of the Linggong sect succession ceremony, she would rather sacrifice herself and abide by the rules. Similarly, Su Chan was also a girl who attached great importance to tradition. But unlike Zi Yuan's observance of tradition was influenced by her childhood environment. Everyone told her that she had to abide by tradition and rules, so she became a mechanical doll that was fully wound up and walked on a fixed track. Su Chan, on the other hand, had not been exposed to modern things since she was a child. All she had been exposed to was the traditional culture of the cultivation world. She had no other choice, so she had also become a very traditional person. However, the longer she stayed in the secular world, the more Su Chan tended to be a modern person. It was just that she had been deeply influenced since she was a child, and tradition was a strong inertial force for her. In sharp contrast to them, Zhou Qin, the daughter of an official who had already come out of seclusion, had been cultivating diligently day and night after being enlightened by Zhang Zhishuan. Her cultivation realm had improved by leaps and bounds, and she had already broken through to the middle level of the Jinshan. As long as she comprehended the unity of heaven and man infinite void, she would be able to cultivate to the extreme level of the Jinshan and reach the perfect jade body realm like Li Yundong. Zhou Qin was not a very traditional person. She was very rebellious in her bones, but in fact, sometimes rebellion was a different kind of tradition. Especially after she converted to Li Yundong, she became the most devout cultivator. She tried her best to maintain everything in the cultivation world. As for things like tradition, she was even more duty-bound to maintain it. In addition, this was their first spring festival with Li Yundong. Whether it was out of justice or out of personal feelings, they all wanted to have a prosperous and lively spring festival. But according to the traditional rules, the spring festival was celebrated at the beginning of the Little New Year, that is, on the 23rd or 24th of the 12th lunar month. The reason why there was a difference of 2 days was because of the so-called officials 3, people 4, boatmen 5, which meant that the government would offer sacrifices on the 23rd of the 12th lunar month. The ordinary people would offer sacrifices on the 24th, and the boatmen who made a living on the water would offer sacrifices on the 25th. China was a world of agricultural culture, and the people loved the soil. Therefore, people who made a living on the water seemed to be a group of non-mainstream people at that time. Therefore, the saying that the Little New Year would be celebrated on the 25th was not widespread. It was generally celebrated on the 23rd and the 24th. Most of the cultivators in the ancient cultivation world were officials. In the Han Dynasty, the 5 pecks of rice sect was popular in Sichuan and Shu. The local ruler, Zhang Lu, was even the leader of the 5 pecks of rice sect, the grandson of Zhang Daoling, the founder of Taoism. The celestial master Taoism in the Wei, Jin, and northern and southern dynasties, and the Loguan Taoism in the Tang dynasty were all major cultivation sects that had been recognized by the emperor and the government. The leader or head of these sects all had very high official positions. Among them, the founders of the Taoist assembly in the Tang dynasty, Great Jinren Luo Gongyuan Yi Fashion, and others were all high officials and rich salaries. Among them, Yi Fashion was even conferred the title of Honglu Minister and Duke of Yu during the period of Emperor Ruizong of the Tang dynasty. In the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties, the cultivation world had entered the heyday of China's 2,000-year feudal history. The leader of Jingyi school was conferred the title of Great Jinren by the emperor of the Song dynasty many times and was given the title of Celestial Master. He had the power to suggest the appointment and dismissal of Taoist affairs management officials and Taoist temple managers in Jiangnan, and to propose to the emperor the funding and staffing of new Taoist temples. He even had the power to directly issue diplomas. This power had only been possessed by the government since ancient times, which also meant that in this period, the cultivation world had officially become a bureaucratic class. In the Yuan dynasty, with the support of Genghis Khan and Kublai, the Chuanzhan sect rose. Qiu Chuji and his disciples even held more power than the leader of Jingyi school in the past. This situation did not fade until the death of Emperor Jiajing of the Ming dynasty and the succession of Emperor Wanli. Therefore, although the cultivation world had almost been forgotten, they still followed the tradition of celebrating the Small New Year on the 23rd, which was the day when the government celebrated the Small New Year. There were two traditions during the Small New Year. One was to sweep the new year, and the other was to offer sacrifices to the kitchen god. As the name suggested, sweeping the new year was to clean the whole family before the end of the year. As for offering sacrifices to the kitchen god, it was easier to understand. It was an activity held to worship the kitchen god. The day before the 23rd of the 12th lunar month, Li Yundong transferred the last batch of little foxes who had stayed at Desangxian to guard their posts back. The next day they got up early. From him to Su Chan, Ziyuan, Zhou Qin, Lin Miao, Chao Yi, Lu Yuehong, and the little foxes of the Fox Zen school, they all rolled up their sleeves and got busy at home. Although they were all cultivators with high or low cultivation quotients, it was reasonable to say that cleaning was a very common thing. However, they all did it very seriously without the slightest neglect. The little foxes all rolled up their sleeves, revealing their arms that were like snow lotuses, and carefully wiped the glass and the floor. As the leader of the sect, Li Yundong naturally set an example. He held a broom and didn't use any spiritual power or magic. He lay on the floor and wiped the dust under the bed. Behind him, Su Chan followed like a little tail. She held a dustpan in her hand and pointed behind him with a smile. Here, there's dust. Li Yundong listened to her talking energetically behind him. It was even more lively than what he was doing. He couldn't help but turn around and say with a smile, "Hey, where is the dust? Why can't I see it?" Su Chan pointed to the corner with a smile. "Over there, you can only see it from my angle." Li Yundong smiled and handed the dusty broom to her nose. "Only you can see it? Well, you can sweep it." Su Chan immediately covered her nose with her hand and said with a smile, "It's so dirty. Take it away. It was you who said not to let me sweep it. Why are you regretting it now?" Li Yundong snorted and said, "I didn't ask you to idle around and command me." Su Chan giggled. Just as she was about to speak, she heard a knock on the door behind them. They turned around and saw that Ziyuan was wrapped in a purple silk scarf, which was obviously used to cover up the dust. At her level of cultivation, once her jinqi was surging, it would really be impossible for a drop of rain to get close to her and a speck of dust to stain her. However, the tradition of sweeping the new year could not be done with jinqi. Otherwise, in the past, it would have been considered a crime of great disrespect. Ziyuan knocked on the open door with her finger, and with her other hand she gently pulled down the scarf on her head. The black hair on her head also fell down like a waterfall. She shook her head slightly and shook her beautiful hair, as if she wanted to shake off the dust on her head. At this moment, the fairy who used to walk in the clouds seemed to have fallen into the mortal world and become a housewife. Li Yundong and Su Chan looked at each other and smiled. Li Yundong asked with a smile, "What's wrong?" Ziyuan smiled and said, "Everyone is almost done cleaning up and preparing to sacrifice to the kitchen stove. You can only do this alone. We will hide away." Ziyuan was a cautious and prudent person and rarely joked with others. Her words were quite playful. Li Yundong immediately laughed and shook his head like a rattle. He knew that the traditional custom of sacrificing to the kitchen stove in ancient times was that women could not participate. As the saying went, men did not worship the moon, and women did not worship the kitchen stove. Worshipping the moon referred to the 7th day of the 7th month, when the cowherd and the weaver girl met in the Milky Way. It was commonly known as the Daughter's Day. On that night, in ancient times, women would go to the balconies and courtyards, display fruits and pastries, light incense and candles, and pray to the moon until late at night. This was a women's festival. Of course, a man should not participate in it. The fact that women did not worship the kitchen stove showed the strong feudal custom of men were superior to women, and men were superior to women. In the Tang dynasty, Duan Qingshi wrote Yang Zizu, Nuogeo Ji, it said that the kitchen god was named Yu and looked like a beautiful woman. It meant that the kitchen god was a handsome man who was as handsome as a beautiful woman. The man was afraid that there would be suspicion of adultery after the woman worshipped the kitchen stove, so there was a saying that women did not worship the kitchen stove. Ziyuan's adherence to tradition seemed to be a little old-fashioned and even pedantic. She followed it regardless of whether it was good or bad, just like what her master Wang Yuanshan had said to her. Whether it was true or false, she would do it. Li Yundong didn't care about this. He shook his head even more and said, "What are you talking about? What era are we in? Women don't worship the kitchen stove? Don't joke around. There are so many people here and I'm the only man. You want me to worship the kitchen stove alone? Isn't this a joke?" Ziyuan pursed her lips and said with a smile, "I don't care. The rules can't be broken. You go to worship the kitchen stove by yourself. We're going out to buy some New Year's goods." Li Yundong was anxious. "Don't. You left me alone at home. Are you all going shopping? That's outrageous, isn't it?" However, Ziyuan shook her head with a smile. Her attitude was very firm. Li Yundong had no choice but to turn his head to look at Su Chan, only to see her giggle. She jumped to Ziyuan's side and said with a smile, "I'm going shopping with Sister Ziyuan." Li Yundong was so angry that he rolled his eyes and said angrily, "I just went out to buy some New Year's goods yesterday, and today you guys are making trouble again. Alright, you can all go out. I'll stay at home alone. Let's see how much money you have to squander." Ziyuan pursed her lips and smiled. She turned around and went out and Su Chan followed her out. After a while the little foxes obviously got the news. They cheered and rushed out of the door one after another. The originally lively house suddenly became deserted. Li Yundong sat down on the edge of the bed gloomily and muttered in his heart, "Should I stay to worship the damn kitchen stove, or should I just go shopping with them?" Although it was only the Lunar New Year's Eve, it was too miserable to be left alone at home, wasn't it? Just as Li Yundong was hesitating, he suddenly saw a pretty face poking out of the door. Her eyes were curved into arcs with a smile. Who else could it be but Su Chan? Li Yundong was shocked and then overjoyed. He waved to Su Chan and said, "You didn't go?" Su Chan threw herself into Li Yundong's arms with a burst of fragrance and smiled slyly like a little fox who had done something bad and had succeeded in her trick. "Hee, when they all go out, I can be intimate with my master." As she said this, the little girl looked at Li Yundong with a face full of resentment. "Master, how long has it been since we've been intimate? I want to be intimate with you." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.